يشرفني دعوة الدكتورة لانا شحادة لتكون مسيرة لجلسات هذه الجلسة. الدكتورة لانا شحادة هي أستاذ مساعد في الاقتصاد السياسي في الجامعة العربية الأمريكية في فلسطين. يركز عملها على تقاطع الدين والسياسة والاقتصاد في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. نشرت أعمالها في مجلة السياسة والدين، ومجلة الدراسات الإثنية والعرقية، ومجلة الدراسات العربية الفصلية، ومجلة الشؤون العربية المعاصرة. دكتورة لانا، اتفضلي، المنصة لك.
شكرا إياد. اسمحوا لي أحول من اللغة العربية للإنجليزية. I want to welcome you all back to the third and final day of the Policy and Conflict Resolution Studies Center at the Arab American University of Palestine's annual conference titled The Age of Populism. For the past 2 days, we have tackled with the concept of populism and how it is applicable to leaders and regimes around the globe. This evening is no different. We will have the opportunity to tune into the research of scholars focusing on this very topic. This evening, we will begin our panel with Dr. Andrew Erato. Dr. Erato is a professor of political and social theory in the Department of Sociology at the New School in New York City. Dr. Erato's research concentrates on the history of social and political thought, legal and constitutional theory, historical problems of revolutions and radical transformations, and sociology of law. He is best known for his influential book titled Civil Society and Political Theory, co-authored with Dr. Jean L. Cohen. He's also known for his work on critical theory, constitutions, and was the co-editor of the Journal of Constellations from 1994 to 2014. Dr. Erato, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Lana, and to this wonderful center at the American Arab University, which I have my first chance to visit. I hope I get opportunity to do it again in the future, because I am interested in some issues that you may be interested in, but I think equally so, I am, in terms of my background and history too, I'm very interested in the region and its faith, and I think this kind of opportunity allows us to talk about those matters in an open and serious way, free from the immediate pressure of this very, very intense, not I say conflict, but set of conflicts, because it's multiple conflicts that you are blessed with in your region. I want to stay with my topic, especially because I get a chance at the round table to try to apply it. But I think very often I'm frustrated by my political theory colleagues that they don't combine theory with empirical work on areas and problems, and I always try to overcome that. And I feel strange here to speak to you about this topic as if we were anywhere. We could be in Johannesburg or Budapest or Montreal or New York and talk about this. And indeed, Latin American countries know more about the topic than the rest of us. But still, it makes a difference to me where we are. And so let me do the sort of standard thing. I think I have about 25 minutes. So for the first 10 minutes, let me do something standard, 12 and a half, and then talk about applications, which is extremely difficult in terms of your region, as I already indicated yesterday. So as you know, I'm writing a book with Jean Cohen. In fact, it's already written and should be out in November. And what she said yesterday is something that I fully share, which is in particular the definition of the phenomenon we're dealing with, populism. I'm not going to go through all her steps, claims in the name of popular sovereignty, part standing for the whole, friend-enemy relations, embodiment in a charismatic leader, and interest above all in in a very strong notion of politics rather than the political in the everyday sense. That's how we define a phenomenon. And one of my contributions to the joint project as a historian, because that's what I am by training, sociology I teach, but I never studied the subject. Philosophy also, that I have studied and I also have taught it, but sociology I never studied. Thank God, I think, on some level. Because professional sociology has never attracted me for one minute, although sociology as a great field created by the founders, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, that has interested me. Anyway, so my point is that in my case, as a historian originally, what I added to the topic was a historization of it in some sense, in terms of a developmental model. I was kind of amazed to find, as I'm teaching a course on fascism, that Robert Paxton applied a model of this kind to a history of fascism. And I want to say something about fascism as I go along, but we developed the stage model for populism. And Jean explained that the stages are movement, being a movement political party, being in government, and becoming the government in a complete sense, which is a kind of prelude to a regime transformation. So regime 2 is a stage. I always felt a little uneasy about this because I don't know if any populist project ever reached the regime change. In the case of fascism, we know that fascism has reached the regime change. In the German case, is something like 1 year. But still, in the case of populisms, who has Maduro? Is that the representation of a populist regime? Putin, it's a difficult question. But anyway, leaving that doubt to the side, I stay with these particular stages. And these stages have to be understood in a certain way. Jean said, ideal types. They may not all follow in succession. As Vladimir Ilyich Lenin has already told us, one can skip stages and go leap from one to the other, and that one can show in this case as well. And of course, the model is not necessarily completed. In the case of fascism, many fascisms in Europe in the 1930s, in the world, in fact, but only 2 completed the developmental logic, which resembles our stage model. So stages have to be used, but should not be believed in a very strong way. This will be actually very interesting when I try to apply what I'm doing to your region. But first, before then, the topic, which I assign myself. Nahid, whom I love, put it down, and she's absolutely staying within my own proposal. But I kind of realized that it's not the most exciting thing to have chosen on my part. I think the issue of civil society, on which we have written a lot, would have been better. I think, especially being in the Palestinian half of this territory, that would be the most relevant topic. In the Israeli part, constitution, I think, would be more salient. But still, you are in a single territorial, whatever it is. And so constitution is relevant to all of you in some way. I'll address that in a second, but let me just briefly explain what my own particular take on constitution and populism is, because this is one of the things, that distinguishes the populists from the fascists. The 2 realized models of fascist project had no interest in constitution making. I don't know all of you realize, but the Italian fascists kept the Statuto Albertino of the 19th century in place, never abolished it. And even under Hitler, the Weimar Constitution was not formally replaced. So fascists stay within a formal constitutional setting, and and establish their own regime without using constitutional tools. Am I speaking too fast? No, okay. You have to watch that with the translation. Okay, so the fascists, a little, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not reading. So in some ways, I shouldn't be as difficult as some of the others who will be not mentioned now. But in any case, I'll slow down. So the fascists are not interested in that. Not every single populism is, but if you look around from all the way from Latin America, Vargas and Perón first, and down to our own time, the neo-populist experiments, even the right-wing ones like Alberto Fujimori's, constitution becomes a stake. Constitution making becomes a formal project. This may follow from two things, and I don't want to try to explain it. One is the electoral interest, which means that you're not going to come to power through coup or force in most of these cases, and the other one may have to do with what is related to it. Carlos mentioned it, and I love to participate with Carlos together at any of these things because I learned so much from him. Carlos mentioned the relationship to violence. So the fact rejecting violence implies, it did even for Hitler and Mussolini in some way, a kind of commitment to legal transition. So constitutional interest comes from that. But at the same time, as I already said, populists reject the established political order, and that, of course, means potentially that they want to replace it. Now, in my stage model, what is one conclusion from it is that a lot of issues change. Namely, once we have defined populism, and I try to define it in such a way that it applies to all the stages, once you have defined it, you have to, of course, say that things change from stage to stage. So comparison is always important in space. We compare one populism with another, but comparison is also important in time because any populist project itself changes. And the way it does change is indicated also by the relationship to constitutions. Because in the movement stage, populists, this is even true for fascists, weirdly enough, call on the existing constitution, the existing constitutional structure to defend them against political repression, against political interventions, and so on. They may say we're going to make a new constitution, but in a way they utilize. And in the case of populists, I have not seen in the case of any movement, populist movement, maybe there is something like this with Le Pen in France, a proposal during the movement stage to change the constitution. Even Le Pen only promises to return to the authentic Fifth Republic, more presidential than now its current incarnation. So at this particular stage of movement, constitution is not a major stake, and in fact, the existing constitution is often utilized. Once populism in government, though, then the problem changes because in government, this is the way Jean defined it rightly, in my view, there are other political branches in the hands of other forces. As a result, the separation of powers limits a populist executive. Mostly it's the executive that is the important to populists. And so in that sense, the struggle against constitution, liberal constitutionalism, they always say, but I think any system based on separation of powers then begins. And then when the stage of being the government is reached, then the populists launch a replacement project. That's the normal normal scenario, and a new regime would mean that replacement has indeed taken place. Okay, so that's how the topic of today, my topic, fits into the stage model. Again, I have to immediately warn, I know Carlos is thinking this because he knows all these things, that there are places where immediately upon having reached governmental power, populists launch their own constitutional project. And this is true, I think, for President Chavez. I think for Korea, in his country too, this was more or less true, and Morales too. So I think in those settings, but Orban in Hungary, so this is not just a left-wing populist habit. Orban in Hungary has launched a project already in 2010. He came to power in 2010. So other populists can indeed anticipate the problem they're going to have with the separation of powers. They take the idea of a new regime, a new constitutional structure seriously, so they launch a constitutional project early. Some would love to launch one early, like the Polish party in power, but they do not have the power to be able to do it. They don't have what in Hungary we always call the 2/3, namely the constitution amending majority. So a desire to make a new constitution emerges, but not necessarily the ability. Of course, constitutional politics does not just operate, this my long chapter, which I sent to you, explains, doesn't just operate in terms of full replacement. Constitutional amendments, as in Erdogan's Turkey, can play the role of a substitution for replacement. In other words, reiterated amendments following period after period can, in the end, even a single amendment, of course, could change the identity of a constitution. So launching an amendment process is a possibility. Let's not be too formal. People sometimes change the constitution by executive decrees and by statutes. And this, of course, is also done by populists already in government. But you can't get away with it if a constitutional court or an apex court is in place, which will declare the statutes and the decrees unconstitutional. So almost inevitably, a conflict with the court in place is an early stage, an early demonstration of the interest of the populists in the constitution. You see this everywhere. I don't want to say that every government that has a conflict with a court is populist. I can foresee that President Biden, if they get through the legislative branch, which is already very difficult, is likely to run into a wall with the Trump court, which is now in place. And this is, of course, what happened in the case of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had more populist in him than President Biden does. But in any case, I don't want to say that that conflict in itself is a mark of populism. Nevertheless, populists invariably engage in struggles with courts, which leads to what was called in the United States in the 1930s, court packing. If I don't have the power to make a new constitution, I can at least replace the people who say what the Constitution is. And that's the judges. So this is the one of the signs of constitutional politics. In a country like Hungary, which is my own country, blessed with the different aspects of this phenomenon, all these things happened. All these things happened. There was court packing, there were amendments, and there's replacement. And I think that this would be true for Venezuela, at least. Carlos must correct me always when I make mistakes on Latin America. I think this is true in Venezuela too. Court packing, jurisdiction transformation, amendments, and then replacement. And sometimes even after the replacement comes a further project of court packing and amending. That's the interesting thing, is that replacement doesn't seem to be enough in many cases. I think that I will say this because this might be relevant to your region, is that if the replacement occurs early and brings into play other forces allied with the populist party in power, the likelihood is that things get into the constitution which the populist party in power does not like, which means then that they're going to even start amending their own constitution or violating it. This is wonderful in the case of Venezuela, I would say Bolivia. I don't know about Ecuador, but there was amending after the making of the constitution. But certainly Fidesz in Hungary does the same. Is this overly dry? This is very legal. I don't know if people are really bored by this stuff. And there is one more step that I want to.
We only have 5 more minutes. Just.
Oh, okay. So I will leave my remarks on your region to the round table mostly, but I want to anticipate something. So one more step in the argument is that what kind of constitutions will the populists make? And again, if they make it early, things will get in which are not their product. But the continual process of amendment suggests that the populists are interested, what has been described by some authors, and I adopt this view, the constitutionalism of the permanence of the constituent power. In other words, a constitutionalism which focuses on the ability of a government in power to shape the constitution politically as it goes along. That's what the continual amendment process, even after making a constitution, indicates. Okay, so this is the basic structure of my argument. Now here's a thing which I want to anticipate for the round table, and I will take only 4 minutes now in saying it, is that you live not just in a very complicated political reality, but you live in an extremely complicated constitutional reality as well. I think everybody here knows Israel, so I don't have to introduce anything, but you know that Israel starts with a failed constitutional project in 48. And this is very partially substituted for what they call basic laws. Just as Barak tried to transform them into a real constitution, I think he failed. So an Israeli populist, and I think it is populist in power recently, although one difficulty in Israel is that it is not a single force, but a plurality of populist actors. Even their combination in power is not very much restricted by an existing constitution, so does not enter into the same struggles, although the struggle of Likud against Barak indicates that even there, even an element of constitutionalism is problematic for the true populist. It's not a lot of constitutionalism. Barak, I don't mean Yehud Barak, I mean Aram Barak. You know what I'm talking about, of course. Aram Barak is a genuine constitutionalist. You may not like some of his decisions, and I certainly don't, but in any case, he tried. And I think mostly failed. And Netanyahu has been the most determined enemy of that type of restriction. And they keep on playing this game. It doesn't quite come to an end, because I think there are factions and groups that believe in constitutions. But in any case, it is something that is different than in any other populist setting. By the way, I would say that the Joint List should be very interested in constitution in that part of your territory. and I've known, well, I guess not, his father even was such a lawyer. Many of the cases that come have to be administered under that kind of law, not just the military law of the occupation, especially for Israeli Arabs. I know the politically correct term is Palestinians in Israel, so I can use that too. I don't mind. In any case, they have to deal with the remnants or elements of constitutionalism and the courts. And so in that sense, there is a kind of reality. Now, just to end, and for me to talk about your reality, which is already double, because the West Bank and Gaza are two very different places, as all of you know pretty well. I think that I would not describe constitutionalism as a feature of your existence. I don't know, maybe some of you disagree because there can be informal customs which play that kind of role, but for me, that's too weak. But what you do have, as I said yesterday, is you do have formation of civil society. Indeed, you have movements, you have initiatives, and these would benefit from any kind of constitutional structure. So there may be an issue of introducing elements of constitutionalism in the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, it sounds absurd on some level, right, in terms of the existing empirical reality, and yet there is a normative point to it. Because civil associations, lawyers, NGOs should have an interest in this, but so do the populists. So do the populists. So this is an interesting twist on our topic, that in your two countries, Gaza and West Bank, is it two countries? Well, one country, doesn't matter right now. In the two places, the two territories, right, there should be even a populist who wants to organize and mobilize around their conception and their ideas could have an interest in introducing elements of constitutionalism. Whether it is in the whole or if just in your own territories is another matter. So I would say that in this sense, the tension between populists and Democrats, well, those who are interested in popular politics, need not be as great. But this is at a stage. And imagine success. I don't know, I'm too old probably to see what I would like to see, namely a federal arrangement of the whole territory with each section having a high level of autonomy. I think that's better than a one-state or a two-state solution. Yeah. But I'm not going to get to see it. But I think if you aim at something like that, then the problem of constitutions is going to be relevant to you. I stop.
Thank you so much. That's a perfect transition to our next speaker, who's Dr. Khalid Hroub. Dr. Hroub is a professor in residence of the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Northwestern University in Qatar. His focus is Middle East studies and politics, with particular interest on Islam and politics, Arab-Israeli conflict, and Arab media studies. Dr. Hroub is also a research associate at the Center of Islamic Studies of the Faculty of Asian and Middle East Studies at the University of Cambridge, where he was the founder and director of Cambridge Arab Media Project until 2012. Dr. Hroub will be offering a paper today titled Religious and Imperialist Populism, Support of Zionism Then and Now. Dr. Hroub, اتفضل.
اوكي، شكرا جزيلا على التقديم وعلى المؤتمر وعلى الجهد وعلى كل شيء. عملت تعديل بسيط في عنوان المداخلة وسميتها الشعبوية الاستعمارية بين قوسين والإمبريالية ودعم الصهيونية حاضرا. يعني دخلت هذا المصطلح وبحاول كل المداخلة سوف تكون تقريبا في محاولة يعني التنظير أو تناول هذا المصطلح. هل هذا مصطلح ممكن نستخدمه ولا هو مفتعل ولا فائدة من وراءه؟ الشعبوية الاستعمارية، colonial populism. المداخلة تنقسم إلى 4 أقسام. القسم الأول مقدمة أوجز فيها الأفكار الأساسية التي أطرحها حول هذه الفكرة الشعبوية الاستعمارية. القسم الثاني أحاول في تقعيد نظري لهذا المفهوم، مواجهة السؤال إن كان هذا المفهوم يقدم لنا ما هو جديد على صعيد تعميق فهم المدارس المسائل قيد الدرس، أم مجرد تمرين ربما يضيف عبء نظري من دون أن يكون له فعالية مفهومية. لذلك أنا أقدم كل هذه المداخلة بحذر شديد. ليس هناك أي لأقول فكرة كاملة وصلبة وبالإمكان الدفاع عنها من ناحية نظرية من ناحية هذا المفهوم. هي قيد التشكل لنقول. هذا الدراسة وهذا المقاربة قيد التشكل. وأنا بشكركم أن أتحتوا لي في الواقع مواجهة هذه المعضلة مسألة الشعبوية ومواصلة التفكير فيها، وأحيانا النجاح وأحيانا الفشل حتى في استيعابها وتطبيقها. القسم الثالث أقدم فيه المثال المباشر على الشعبوية الاستعمارية في الحالة الفلسطينية، وهي استهدافها لفلسطين والفلسطينيين من منطلقات دينية وحضارية وإمبريالية، وتأكيدها على حق اليهود في العودة إلى أرض الميعاد بين قوسين. القسم الرابع والأخير أطرح فيه بعض التساؤلات على نفسي وعليكم حول الفرق بين هذا المفهوم الذي أطرحه، الشعبوية الاستعمارية والاستشراق، لأنه أنا نفسي واجهت مشكلة أنه بعد ما حاولت أتحدث عن هذا المفهوم رأيته قريب جدا من الاستشراق. على كل حال، في المقدمة أقول أنه هنا في هذه المحاولة اختبار لمفهوم الشعبوية ضمن سياقات وتحديدا كولونيالية وإمبريالية، وأناقش هنا إن كان استخدام هذا المفهوم يقدم لنا معرفة إضافية في السياق الكولونيالي أم أنه قليل الفائدة وربما عديمة. في إطار هذا الاختبار تطرح الورقة مفهوم الشعبوية الاستعمارية وتعريفه، وعبر هذا الشكل تتمظهر الشعبوية خارج إطارها المحلي يعني تخرج من إطارها الوطني المحلي، وتستهدف عدوا جديدا ومختلفا خارج حدودها القومية. وأحاول هنا موضعة هذا الشكل الامتدادي الإضافي للشعبوية في إطار النقاش حولها. في سياق تطبيق أتناول بعض الملامح الأساسية للشعبوية الاستعمارية تجاه فلسطين وشعبها على وجه الخصوص، وتجاه اليهود وفكرة عودتهم المسيحانية إلى أرض الميعاد، وكيف تطورت هذه الشعبوية الاستعمارية منذ النصف الأول من القرن التاسع عشر على أقل تقدير. هذه الشعبوية الاستعمارية أراها قد اشتغلت بشكل أساسي في مجالين: المجال الديني الذي تطور لاحقا في اتجاه المسيحية الصهيونية، والمجال الإمبريالي التوسعي للدول الغربية الكبرى الذي كان قد شهد تطورا للتنافس المرير على السيطرة في الشرق ومن ضمنه فلسطين. في كلا المجالين الديني والإمبريالي ترافقت المخططات الاستراتيجية العسكرية والاقتصادية الهادفة إلى السيطرة والنفوذ والاحتلال مع صعود وتمأسس خطابات الشعبوية الاستعمارية الداعمة للتوسع والاحتلال بمسوغات دينية وحضارية. الآن اشتغل هذا التعاضد بين ما هو استراتيجي وما هو شعبوي طيلة القرون الثلاثة الماضية، وما زال في رأيي متواصلا حتى اليوم، ويجسد نص ما سمي صفقة القرن أو خطة ترامب للسلام التتويج الأكثر صراحة ووقاحة لهذا التعاضد بين الشعبوية الاستعمارية وبين المخططات الاستراتيجية في الوقت الحديث. تجاورت فيه مكونات الشعبوية الاستعمارية مثل احتقار الفلسطينيين، النظرة الدونية إليهم وإلى حقوقهم، وتبجير اليهود وإسرائيل دينيا وحضاريا، مع اعتبارات استراتيجيات الهيمنة والسيطرة الأمريكية في المنطقة. لأنتقل بسرعة إلى القسم الثاني وهو القسم النظري، يعني أحاول فيه تعريف مفهوم الشعبوية الاستعمارية ونحت هذا المفهوم، وهل تقدم ما هو جديد أم أن كل هذا النقاش افتعالي ولا مكان له في كل الجدل حول مسألة الشعبوية. يعني في هون قدر ما من المغامرة، خاصة بوجود أساتذة وسلطات معرفية في موضوع الشعبوية، في قدر كبير من المغامرة النظرية في هذا النص، خاصة في القسم الثاني. أقول فيه أنه في الأدبيات المهمة حول الشعبوية طبعا هناك جدل عميق ونقاش مفتوح حول تعريف المفهوم، وليس هناك اتفاق على تعريف الشعبوية. هناك تعريفات مختلفة ومتعددة، وهناك مقاربات من زوايا مختلفة، ومكونات، هنا المهم مكونات مؤسسة ترتبط بالظواهر السياسية المقصودة بالحديث عن الشعبوية. يعني هناك مكونات، أنا ألتقط بعض هذه المكونات، وفي محاولة صوغ تعريف للشعبوية الاستعمارية اعتمدت على جزء من هذه المكونات النظرية، حاولت تطوير بعضها واستفدت من غياب أو تغييب بعض الآخر، وخلصت إلى التعريف الذي سوف آتي عليه بعد قليل. ما هي المكونات التي استخدمتها من الجدل حول الشعبوية وتعريفاتها؟ المكون الأول الذي اتكأت عليه هو أهمية السياق ومركزيته. يعني تقريبا في معظم الجدل حول هذا، يعني الكونتكست، السياق هو مهم وتقريبا حاسم. في النظر في فهم الشعبوية، لونها، توجهها، تكوينها إلى آخره. طبعا من الواضح أنه سياق الدولة الغربية مثلا الناجزة والديمقراطية والغنية لا علاقة له بسياق الدولة النامية غير الناجزة أحيانا والفقيرة دائما، فضلا عن تباين سياق ثالث مختلف وهو سياق علاقات الهيمنة والسيطرة بين المستعمر والمستعمر. يعني كان هناك 3 سياقات، فلا نستطيع أن نأخذ سياق الدولة الغربية وكيفية تطور الشعبوية فيها وننقله إلى سياق دولة نامية وتتعرض مثلا لضغوط خارجية على سبيل المثال، أو إلى سياق استعماري مثل سياق فلسطين. وسياق فلسطين هو سياق استعماري كولونيالي، يعني هذا يجب أن يبقى في ذاكرتنا أو في عقلنا عند السجال. يعني ذكر قبل لا قليل يعني أندرو يعني رياليتي أو الواقع حول غياب الكونستيتيوشنال رياليتي مثلا، إنه هذا واقع موجود، لكن كمان في واقع آخر موجود إحنا عندنا هو واقع مشكل يعني فورماتيف للرياليتي الفلسطينية، هو الكولونيال كونتكست. فهذا هو في رأيي كروشال، هذا حاسم في تحديد الظواهر السياسية وفهمها. المهم هذا المكون الأول هو السياق ومركزيته. المكون الثاني من الجدل الدائر حول الشعبوية الذي حاولت أن أستخدمه هو جدل الشعبوية في إطار الدولة، في إطار النيشن ستيت، كما هي الغالبية الكاسحة من الحالات، وكما في مجمل النقاشات التي تدور حول أنه هذا الشعبوية تدور داخل النيشن ستيت، داخل الدولة. الاستفادة هنا تكمن في غياب عمليا أو خفوت هذا المكون في نقاش ما سوف أناقشه، الشعبوية الاستعمارية. أن الشعبوية الاستعمارية لا تتم أو مجال عملها واشتغالها ليس في النيشن ستيت، هي ترحل خارج هذا النيشن ستيت وتشتغل خارج الدولة عمليا. ففي هذه الحالة تنتقل الشعبوية إلى ما وراء الحدود وتستهدف آخر بين قوسين غريب تماما عنها، ونصبح أمام شعبوية ليست محلية وأطراف الصراع فيها ليسوا يسار ويمين، نخبة وشعب إلى خلاف ذلك، بل نحن أمام شعبوية مصدرة إلى الخارج ومندرجة في الصراعات والاحتلالات الإمبريالية، بخلاف كما قلت الشعبوية المحلية المستبقى للاستهلاك والصراع الداخلي. المكون الثالث الذي أحاول أن أستخدمه في صوغ التعريف مرتبط بما يطرحه أرنستو لاكلاو من أن الشعبوية تتبع منطق الفعل السياسي، يعني political action logic، مش بس يعني هيك. وهذا بقودنا في استنباط وموضع تعريف رد الفعل المقاوم على الاستعمار. يعني في عندنا شعبوية استعمارية وفي استعمار، الآن في رد فعل، فرد الفعل المقاوم على الاستعمار، وفي مكان إن كان بإمكاننا أن نسميه شعبوية أخرى ونقول هذه شعبوية المقاومة. يعني هناك قائد شعبي يستطيع أو شعبوي حتى ممكن يقود عملية ضد الاستعمار، عملية التحرير والمقاومة ضد الاستعمار، وقد ينتقل من الشعبية إنه إلى الشعبوية. الآن أصبحت أمامنا ربما شعبوية جديدة، شعبوية المقاومة مثلا، هذه ممكن نستفيد منها في السياق الفلسطيني في التحليل إلى آخره. لكن المهم هنا أهمية طرح لاكلاو تكمن في إضافة بعد معياري مهم نورماتيف في النقاش حول الشعبوية، ويحررنا من أسر الفكرة الابتسارية التي تعتبر الشعبوية أداة واحدة بغض النظر عن الأطراف الذين يستخدمونها. يعني ممكن يكون في شعبوية اليسار، في شعبوية اليمين، فكأنه أصبحت الشعبوية مجرد يعني أداتية، يعني في هنا نوع من instrumentalization للشعبوية ممكن يستخدم من قبل الجميع. لاكلاو لما يطرح هذا الطرح انه البوليتيكال لوجيك احيانا بضيف لنا هذا البعد النورماتيف المعياري اللي بخلينا نفرق بين لا في هناك عدم مساواة قيمية واخلاقية بين الشعبويات المختلفة، فلا نستطيع ان نساوي بين شعبوية المستعمر وشعبوية المقاوم، وحتى لو كانت مثلا شعبوية بمعنى احيانا بالايحاءات السلبية التي قد تاتي الى مخيلتنا. اذا هذا المكون تقريبا مكون قيمي معياري. المكون الرابع الذي أمكن الاستفادة من التأمل فيه هو المشترك الأعرض لكل الشعبويات، وهو ادعاء التكلم باسم الشعب in the name of the people. لأن نعرف أن الشعبوية التقليدية تزعم الدفاع عن الشعب باسم الشعب ضد نخبة ما، لكن كيف يمكن أن نقرأ منطق الشعبوية الاستعمارية؟ ما هو الشعب الذي تنطق باسمه؟ أزعم في هذا التعريف أن هذه الشعبوية الاستعمارية تتحدث باسم الشعب، ليس فقط الشعب بل والكيان كله، الدولة وربما الإمبراطورية. إذن هي تتحدث باسم الشعب والمشروع الاستعماري والإمبراطوري أيضا الإمبريالي. لا تتحدث فقط باسم جزء من الشعبويات، تزعم أنها تتحدث باسم الشعب لكن عمليا تعبر عن جزء من الشعب. هنا في الشعبوية الاستعمارية هي تنطق باسم، تزعم أنها تنطق باسم كل المجموع بل والدولة أيضا ومشروعها الخارجي. وطب إذا لكن من هي النخبة العدو؟ يعني إذا قلنا أنها تنطق باسم الشعب ضد نخبة ما، في حالة الشعبوية الاستعمارية من هي النخبة العدو؟ النخبة المفترضة هي دول إمبريالية منافسة، بريطانيا تنافس فرنسا وبلجيكا وإيطاليا والبرتغال مثلا إمبرياليا، ومثلا هذه النخبة الخارجية العدو المفترض، أو قد يكون هذا العدو المفترض هو الجهل والتخلف والظلام في البلد المستهدف احتلاله وتحضير شعبه، لأنه المهمة مهمة طبعا نقل الحضارة، فنقل الحضارة ضد التخلف. ففي أفريقيا، في آسيا، في فلسطين، في الشرق الأوسط، في البلدان العربية هناك تخلف، تأتي هذه المشروعات الإمبريالية والكولونيالية لتخليصنا منه، فالعدو المفترض هو الجهل. إذا يصبح تتحدث الشعبوية الاستعمارية باسم الدولة الإمبريالية وشعبها ومشروعها ضد واحد من هذين العدوين أو كلاهما معا. المكون الأخير مرة أخرى حتى أذكر هذه المكونات أحاول أن أستفيد منها في التعريف الذي اقتربت لمشاركتكم فيه. المكون الأخير الذي يفيد التأمل فيه إذا نحو تعريف الشعبوية هو التباين شكل واتجاه الشعبوية عندما تنشأ في واحدة من بيئتين مختلفتين. بيئة الشعب السياسي، لا أعرف إذا هذه الترجمة كانت دقيقة، اللي هي political people، مقابل بيئة الشعب الإثنوي the ethno-based people. الآن الفرق بينهم أنه political people أو الشعب السياسي اللي هو شوية constitutional، يعني قائم على توافقات دستورية والصراع بين أحزاب نخب كذا تنتظمها نوعا ما توافقات ديمقراطية أو دستورية أو غيرها، فالفرد معرف سياسيا، هنا كلمة سياسي. أنما الإثنو-based people يعني بتكون التعريفات والديناميات الغالبة في الممارسة السياسية إلى حد ما مقادة بصراعات الهوية والصراعات الإثنيات والهويات الجزئية. هذا في داخل الدولة الواحدة. الآن في الشعبوية الاستعمارية القادمة من political people عمليا، من مجتمعات تزعم أنها طبعا ديمقراطية ومتحضرة وأنها وصلت إلى مراتب أفضل بكثير من مراتب الدول التي يتم استعمارها، وتتهم الدول الخاضعة للاستعمار بأنها ما زالت دول إثنية مهجوسة بالهويات وبالطائفية وبالدين وجوهرانية وإلى آخره. لكن عندما تنتقل هذه النقلة الشعبوية الاستعمارية هي تنسى السياسة وتتعامل مع هذه المحطات الجديدة تعامل إثني وجوهراني، هي تراها وكأنها كتل من الشعوب والثقافات التي لا تتغير وذات صفات ثابتة. الآن في ضوء كل ما سبق من مكونات، وآمل أن تكونوا ما زلتم معي وأن لا يكون النقاش يعني تنظيري مجرد، في ضوء كل ما سبق أقدم التعريف التالي للشعبوية الاستعمارية: أنها بنية من الخطابات المتعددة والتعميمات والأوصاف الإطلاقية السطحية والتعبيرات الاختزالية الجاذبة لاهتمام الرأي العام المحلي، لكن حمولتها مصدرة خارج الحدود وموجهة نحو آخر تتم شيطنته دينيا وثقافيا وحضاريا، وتزعم التعبير عن حس جمعوي في تأييدها للسياسات الاستعمارية الاحتلالية التي تقوم بها بلدانها، إلى جانب الحمولة الوصفية الاحتقارية للآخر. وهنا نقطة مهمة جدا في التعريف: إلى جانب الحمولة الوصفية الاحتقارية للآخر، فإن خطابات الشعبوية الاستعمارية تدعو إلى فعل، تدعو إلى غزو الآخر واحتلال أراضيه بناء على مسوغات دينية أو حضارية أو غيرها. وتشتغل هذه الشعبوية في تناغم تام مع المشروعات الإمبريالية والاستعمارية. الآن مع الزمن تحولت الصور والانطباعات التي خلقتها الشعبويات الاستعمارية عن الآخر إلى ما هو قريب من الحقائق من دون أن تخضع إلى اختبار صدقيتها. في الجوهر تلتقي الشعبوية الاستعمارية مع الاستشراق في النظرة الدونية الازدرائية والجوهرانية للآخر، وهنا للشرق وشعوبه وثقافاته وأديانه إلى آخره. لكن هناك فروقات عديدة، أهمها الوظيفة المباشرة، حيث يشتغل الاستشراق عموما في نطاق ما يمكن اختزاله بوصف الشرق وتقديم معرفة موضوعية عنه سواء فعلا أم ادعاء، لكن من دون الانتقال كليا إلى تقديم وصفة لإنقاذ هذا الشرق. يعني passively descriptive بالإنجليزي، بهذا إنه تصف الشرق.
دكتور 5 دقائق.
قديش؟ 5 دقائق؟
5 دقائق.
أوكي طيب، خليني استعجل شوي. اما قلنا في الاستشراق يقدم هذا انه passively descriptive، يصف الشرق. اما الشعبويه الاستعماريه تتجاوز وظيفه الوصف الى وظيفه التعبئه والحشد ودعوه للاحتلال. actively prescriptive، يعني بتقدم وصف انه لازم، ما في حل الا ان نحتلهم والى اخره. خليني أحاول أنتقل إلى القسم الثالث، حتى لأنه الوقت أدركنا شيء الآن، أو لسه في القسم الثاني. ماذا يفيدنا كل النقاش السابق؟ ماذا يفيدنا؟ هل بيفيدنا في الجدل حول الشعبوية؟ أقدم بعض النقاط ربما مفيدة أو ربما غير مفيدة، لكن من باب يعني من باب النقاشات العامة وهذا تحفيز الأفكار. قد هذا المفهوم، مفهوم الشعبوية الاستعمارية، قد يؤدي ما يلي: يحرر هوية من سياق الديمقراطية وكجزء من السجال الغربي، ويطرح وجود ثنائيات من الشعبوية تتجاوز نظريا الجدل الغربي وتوسع النقاش. مثلا يصبح أمامنا شعبوية محلية، الشعبوية اللي بنعرفها وناقشها في السياق الغربي، مقابل شعبوية خارجية كأنه في local populism وفي abroad populism. الثنائية الأخرى التي يطرحها هذا المفهوم هي شعبوية المستعمر مقابل شعبوية المستعمر، الكولونايزر populism مقابل الكولونايزد populism. كمان يمكن الزعم معياريا بقدر كبير من المغامرة مرة أخرى بوجود شعبوية خشنة وشعبوية حميدة، يعني benign populism مقابل malign populism. هذا يعني خاصة فينا، خاصة في شعبوية المستعمر، إنه قد يتطور قائد شعبي ما إلى أن يصبح قائد شعبوي. لكن في كلا الحالتين لا نستطيع أن نقارن هذه الشعبوية بشعبوية المستعمر معياريا. وهي النقطة التي تلي أنه يقدم هذا المفهوم أو ربما يدعم مسألة العنصر المعياري في النقاش حول الشعبوية. أيضا يساعدنا مفهوم الشعبوية الاستعمارية في تفسير موقف الرأي العام الغربي المؤيد للاستعمار والإمبريالية وغزو بلدان وشعوب الآخر، لأنه شيء مدهش. يعني هناك كتب عديدة جدا وأدبيات كلها تشير إلى هذه الحقيقة، إنه كان هناك ليس فقط تواطؤ من قبل الرأي العام الغربي الفرنسي البريطاني البلجيكي الإيطالي الأمريكي لاحقا تجاه ما تقوم به هذه الحكومات من غزو ومن احتلالات إمبريالية للآخرين، بل وهناك تأييد. يعني هناك، فأنت تدهش إنه كل مثلا التحضر البوليتيكال هيك بيبل، ومع ذلك تجاه الآخر هذا هناك موقف شبه موحد. فأقول إنه الشعبوية الاستعمارية بتساعدنا إنه لأنها اشتغلت على الرأي العام لفترات طويلة. وآخر نقطة قد تفيدنا، إنه يفيدنا مثل هذا النقاش وقد يتموضع في يعني ما دراسات أو المناهج الجديدة التي نسميها نزع الاستعمار عن المعرفة، يعني decolonization of knowledge، إنه إحنا بنخرج الشعبوية من إطارها الغربي ونخليها أكثر معولمة وأكثر ربما مؤنسنة. الآن فيما تبقى، هذا هو في الواقع يعني جزء اللي هو كمثال، بحاول أخذ مثال عن الشعبوية الاستعمارية دينيا وإمبرياليا حول فلسطين، وفيه يشرح، ما عندي وقت أمر بالتفاصيل، لكن أتحدث فيه باختصار على كيف إنه الرحالة والمبشرين والزوار وإلى آخره الذين جاءوا إلى فلسطين، ومع تقريبا النصف الثاني من القرن التاسع عشر نتحدث عن عدد هائل، تقريبا 20,000 زائر سنويا كانوا يزوروا فلسطين، أنتجوا أدبيات مهولة عن فلسطين. مارك توين طبعا أشهرهم، وجادسبي في بريطانيا، وهنا وهناك، لكن كل هؤلاء كتبوا، أنتجوا مئات الكتب والأدلة السياحية عن فلسطين. كلها العناصر الأساسية لما أنتجوه لهذه الأدبيات أن فلسطين بلد قذر وصحراء وجرداء، الذين يعيشون فيه منحطون متخلفون وبدو رحل لا ينتمون إلى المنطقة، جاءوا من مناطق ثانية ولا يستحقون أن يكونوا هناك، وأن هذا البلد الحزين الذي فيه ميلاد المسيح وفيه قبر المسيح وفيه التاريخ التوراتي ما زال في أيدي هؤلاء الهمج. هذا تعبيرات مستخدمة وأن الواجب على كل المسيحيين في العالم والغرب في العالم إنقاذ هذا البلد المقدس من هؤلاء الوحوش. يعني هذا باختصار شديد، لكن في تفاصيل مذهلة. فعندما تتحدث إنه هذا هي المخيلة العامة، هذا المخيال العام، المخيال العام في الولايات المتحدة، المخيال العام في بريطانيا، في أوروبا حول فلسطين. ثم جاءت دعوات إعادة اليهود اللي هي أيضا من البروتستانتية، يعني مع الإصلاح المسيحي، تقول أن يجب أن يعود اليهود إلى فلسطين لأن هذا شرط للظهور الثاني للمسيح. فأصبحنا أمام مكون ديني ومكون أيضا حضاري إمبريالي. كيف نحل هذه المشكلة أيضا؟ أن فلسطين تحت وطأة هذا التخلف وتحت وطأة هؤلاء الهمج الذين لا ينتمون إليها. الحل هو عودة اليهود إلى وطنهم وإنقاذ فلسطين، ثم دعم العالم المسيحي لهذا المشروع. هذه الدعوات جاءت وترسخت ونضجت قبل ظهور الصهيونية على الأقل بنصف قرن. فأنت أمام مشروع، يعني عودة اليهود، مشروع إعادة اليهود إلى فلسطين، مشروع مسيحي قبل أن يكون مشروع الصهيونية وقبل نصف قرن. فلذلك عندما جاءت الصهيونية في أواخر القرن التاسع عشر جاءت على بيئة خصبة جدا لهذه الدعوة، وعلى بيئة بالعكس حاضنة. لذلك جزء من نجاح الصهيونية ليس بسبب عبقرية هرتزل ولا عبقرية الزعامات الصهيونية، لا، لكن بسبب أنه في بريطانيا، في فرنسا، في ألمانيا، في الولايات المتحدة كانت الدعوات المسيحية الصهيونية قد تجذرت حتى ليس فقط على مستوى الرأي العام، ولكن أيضا على مستوى صناع القرار السياسي. بعدها بس أختم، بسبب هذه التهيئة أنت هيأت الرأي العام وسلحت صناع القرار عبر هذه الشعبوية الاستعمارية التي استمرت قرن من الزمان. عند ذلك تسهل المهمة الاستعمارية الآن الخشنة، مهمة الاحتلال، ولأن الرأي العام ليس فقط مؤيد بل وداعم، وهو أساسا محفز لك للقيام بهذا المهمة الإنقاذية والحضارية والإمبريالية وسوى ذلك. في كثير من النقاط يمكن ما أتاح لي الوقت أمر عليها، ربما خلال النقاش، لكن شكرا لك.
شكرا لك. Dr. Mohammed Abu Nimr is our next speaker. He is a professor at the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Program and serves as the director of the Peace Building and Development Institute at my alma mater, the American University in Washington, D.C. He has conducted interreligious conflict resolution training and interfaith dialogue workshops in conflict areas around the world, including Palestine, Israel, Egypt, Northern Ireland, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka. Dr. Mohammed Abu Nimr will be presenting a paper titled Populist Movements and Identity Politics, Integration and exclusion of Muslim minorities. Dr. Mohammed Abu Namir.
Thank you, Lena. Good to know that you are AU graduate. That's give us a bit of comfort here for the familiar faces. I am delighted to be with you. I've followed yesterday and today's discussion, engaging discussion, I must say. And also, I am happy to speak at the program. I first time heard about it from different friends, including Ayman Saif, who I met in Germany, and explain about the program. So it's delighted to be part of this annual conference you have. طبعا اسمحوا لي احكي بالانجليزي لانه اذا دخلت بالعربي انا مش متمكن بقدر الدكتور خالد حروب واتبحر في المصطلحات المختلفه، فانا بدي اتكلم بالانجليزي لانه اسهل لي وكمان ممكن تفهموني وافهم حالي اكثر بتامل. ف please forgive me. I would have loved to speak in Arabic, but for time purpose here as well. One more footnote. I come from the question of applied conflict resolution, applied social sciences. So I really look and work from the practice into scholarship. What I do, I try to theorize that. And I'm more busy with less with the theoretical generic diagnostics of the phenomenon of populism and more on the ground trying to answer the question, excellent, we understand it, how do we deal with it right now? What can we do in this response? And I've been working in Europe for the last 7 years, in Austria and different parts of Europe as well, as part of intercultural, interreligious dialogue and linking policy makers, European Union, OSCE, European Parliament, governments, and also political movement with the role of religious leader. So when I saw this populist call for populist paper and was introduced to it, I was very much interested in being part of this and actually learn more about it. So I asked myself, how is our work related to populism, and how is the struggle we've been having for 8 years linking policymakers in European context with religious leaders and the challenges we've been facing in the context of this. And really the context of Europe, political Europe today is, as we all agreed in the last 2 days, populist approach. That's where I come from it. And of course, religion is the intersection for me. So I'm going to focus more on the religious populism here as an element that focuses in Europe, in particular on the Muslim community, Muslim/Arab, but in general, really it's more Muslim. And what is the role of Muslim and Islam in this context of populist movement? In general, the studies of populism, whether they are the first one, ideological or ideational, that divide the society into two homogeneous antagonistic groups, mostly people versus elite, and the leader come to support the people versus the elite, or although he or she can be an integral part of the elite, still they come to stand with the people. A second type of study is strategy that is viewed as a tool in the hands of a personalistic leader who use populism to wield power through an organized voter bank, voting possibility, and you look at strategies to best deal with that. And then you have the studies that deal with discourse. I think Dr. Khalid Hroub, in his recent last 5 minutes or 7 minutes, were really deep into this, the discourse analysis of how was it constructed. So this is a discourse that pits people against elite or the oligarchy, and which adheres to one or multiple ideologies: neoliberal, religious, globalization, migration. Different ideologies can be picked up in constructing this discourse. And the fourth type of studies usually is the style studies that look at the leaders, with their bad manners, their style of performance, the people which also confront the elite. Trump was known for this. Sisi in Erdogan and Sisi in Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey. Studies look at their style of as a populist leader in that sense. In terms of causes, we look at mostly socioeconomic, global, national economic decline, pushing people to become more receptive to the ideas and campaigns of the populist movement or leaders. And, the national economic decline, and then you say Muslim took it, Chinese took the job, or Arabs took the job, or Thai people, or Filipino, and then you build on that more. But that's the socioeconomic. The second one, really, where I am coming from, and we'll talk about it more, is really to say the causes of the people moving, supporting, endorsing populists is the notion of cultural / psychological, and here the emotions, emotions like fear, anger, nostalgia, humiliation, and love for our one's homeland motivate people, and those can be exploited by politicians. And this is also my colleague Yilmaz from Turkey. Hassan Yilmaz done this some of this work as well. When it comes to religion, there is a clear gap in the literature, that there is a gap in the area of studying the link between religion and populism, especially in the context of European right-wing movement, how the right-wing movement have used it. That area has not been explored in such systematic and in-depth way. But religion and religious identity in the context of populism is interesting because, as we all know from sociology, although Dr. Andrew did not like the sociology, but nevertheless, it's really functional to understand from sociology of religion that religion provides a response to fears, respond to uncertainty of faith, respond to purpose, provide calling for people, and after all, provide security, especially in an insecure reality. Religion provides answers, and I think this is the power of religion when it is utilized, manipulated by the populist leaders, the various populist leaders, that it lends itself to this manipulation in many ways. And the religion also creates dichotomies, us versus them, believers, non-believers, sinners and faithful. And this dichotomy of thinking is very conducive to populist strategies, usually of dividing us and them, people and the elite and so forth, or people against everybody else. Also, some populist leaders use religious language to convey their message. You've heard them saying, "I am your savior, vote for me and I will prevent major catastrophe from taking place in your homeland or in your faith." Trump did that, Sisi did that, Modi did that, Netanyahu also have done that. Many of these politicians use that language. We're not inferior, another thing you could hear it by populist leaders saying, also by defending the people, the populist leader and his followers rise above the high culture of elite and illustrate the goodness of the lower class or the lower culture under technique or strategy, if you will, that also can be similar to the religion. And the discourse of populists, you look at it and it mimics religious leaders also. Mimics their preaching style sometimes, good versus evil. Also they bring religious values into the movement, bring the values into the movement if they're religious. But also the secular European populists did something interesting. They elevated the secular values to sacred status, as researchers have indicated as well. I mean, take the liberty, take freedom in France, or take religious, or take the concept of freedom of expression, freedom in general, and it has been elevated by secular leaders to a sacred place in the community, in the public discourse, that one cannot touch it. That becomes the sacred, if you wish, the sacred cow, if you're, or the holy book, the holy sacred item for many followers of the secular movement. You can find many examples on this. Modi, for example, in India, has combined populist rhetoric with Hindu nationalism. He uses the Hindutva narrative to form its domestic political regarding minorities under a populist mandate, especially against Muslims in some areas. Trump used populist rhetoric and established his policy against Muslim. The Muslim ban in general during Trump was based on the religious identity. Imran Khan in Pakistan have used the Medina, Risalat al-Medina or Risalat al-Medina as a religion-based populist approach, and he seeks to promise a sacred welfare to the state itself, as mentioned by Hassan in 2000 in his studies. The ideologists in Indonesia said Chinese are a threat to the Ummah. Evangelical Christians supported the pro-Trump Jericho rally in Washington. It's not by mistake they use the Jericho component here. Buddhist populists in Myanmar and Sri Lanka use the purity of faith and nation as a discourse, as a language against the Rohingya as well, and against the Tamil and Muslim in Sri Lanka. Of course, Shas in Israel, and also as Dr. Hunaida yesterday mentioned, number of these issues in this part. You know, if Muslim, again, if Muslim religious emerge from the matrix of Islam, the same thing, you know, the secular emerge from the matrix of Christianity or the Judeo-Christian in Europe. The Judeo-Christian in Europe as a base for populist, religious populists, is very clear also in the literature. So moving on the core second issue that I want to, or third issue I want to deal with, which is the populism and Islam and Muslim minorities. And here really, I'm dealing with the question, why is it, for example, what is the profile of a person who is receptive to populist discourse? Why they believe that, the support of the populist? Why they believe the campaign against Muslim? And to do that, the profile should include the following component. That person in most cases secluded, has been from Muslim and Islam, no direct contact, personal contact with them, especially no positive direct contact. That person derived the information from certain hate speech media or other sources, and there's plenty of those. That person could be fundamental religious, with fundamental religious belief, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, or other than Muslim. Also, that person could have negative exposure to Islam and Muslim community culture. He or she have met somebody, had a negative experience, so it entered his profile, personal profile, which made him or her more receptive to the message of the populist. Although the message is message of hate, message of antagonism, messages of racism, sometimes exclusion of Muslim, message of fear, still the person accept that and endorse it. Also, the person could be with the ultra-nationalist orientation, just exclusive nationalist who frame the homeland is for the French, the homeland is for the Dutch, and the homeland is for the Austrian, and therefore we should not get any foreigners here. These are at least 5 components of that profile of the person. They don't have to be all together in the same quantity and the quality, but we found those components in the way of thinking of that person who is more receptive to this aspect. Second question, why Muslim minorities are easy target? Why they did not pick on the Jewish or on the Hindu or on the Catholic or on the other religious group? And again, the politics of fear in the European context, also globally, it's easy to link Muslim to ISIS, Iraq, to ISIS, to Al-Qaeda. The link since 9/11 have made Muslim become the ideal type of other, making Islamophobia the primary populist anti-paradigm, as has been mentioned in several studies. Despite Muslim, they comprise 1 to 8% of the population in most European democracy, or average of 5%, 4.9. Their very presence has become one of the defining issues of populist era. it's rarely you find any populist leader in Europe without being obsessed with the Muslim and Islam. Second reason, beside politics of fear, Muslims themselves have a self-imposed seclusion, live in ethnic, religious, linguistic enclaves, whether they're Turkish, African, Bengali in London. You choose any city, you'll find the Muslim enclaves in it in most cases. The enclave prevent contact and allow the imagination of the dominant majority to go wild. Specific policy of settlement, we send the refugees to town and centers and put them in enclave and they come together. Number 4, alienation from the dominant majority of value tradition. Some Muslims actually do believe that it's haram and fasid to connect with the dominant majority, infidels, you could say, or non-believer or unfaithful. So we want to protect our Muslim girls, Muslim boys from this Western culture. So you live in the city, you live in the state, but you do not necessarily, you despised it in many ways. Lack of political participation. You are first generation immigrant from Bangladesh, Pakistan, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, if you wish, and you don't deal with politics. Politics is bad, politics is unsafe, and you don't deal with politics. The less you deal with politics, the less you are visible, the less you are known, and the less the domestic people know you, and therefore you become more easy target for this populism. Absence from the public media, especially first generation, because of self-censor or because of exclusion, deliberate, intentional one. Number 7 is socioeconomic status, income, education. You're first generation immigrant from Syria and you're struggling for basic income. You don't have time to interact with the dominant majority, to have a quality relationship with the other who's different from you. These are at least 7 reasons why the Muslim, and there are many of them I put internal, not necessarily external. I'm leaving the external for other area, but here is a few examples why it's easy. What's the motivation behind this, behind the populism? Why they target Islam? Austria, Denmark, France, Netherlands, Sweden, all of these countries, Muslim and Islam became a tool for electoral bank, voting bank. You attack them, you become more Islamophobic, and you can draw more from the bank of votes. Local and national economic interests is another motivation for why target Muslim themselves. You have Muslim stores, Muslim business in your town, and you've been told that they're taking your jobs. Ideological, of course, there are deep-seated animosity. You know, as Bolkestein from Dutch populist leader in Holland says, you should never underestimate how deeply Moroccan and Turkish immigrants are hated by the Dutch. My political success rests upon the fact that I have listened to these feelings. It's amazing. You have political leader who populist managed to say these things bluntly in how he manipulated these aspects.
Dr. Abu Nimr, just a 5-minute warning.
Thank you. The strategies they are using, dehumanization, the Muslims don't belong here in any group. The far right have done that. The Muslims refuse to be integrated. Look at their habits. Bolkestein have used that. You know, said Salman Rushdie is the example of what Muslims do to those who don't follow them. They are fifth column enemy. Yes, ISIS, terrorism. Even if you have 5 or 6 people, 10 girls went to ISIS, the whole Muslim community became target for this. The Muslims are not loyal citizens. Their allegiance in football games to Algeria, to other countries. So they're not faithful to our citizenship. Their faith is violent. It's the religion of the soul. Finally here, their faith is against our way of life. Europeanists. Our way of life is a really amazing term used these days in Europe to say they threaten our way of life and therefore we cannot accept them as they are. What do we propose in the past 7 years, 8 years? I've been focusing, like many others, on interreligious dialogue. The power of the encounter. bring Muslim community with people who might be prone, receptive to populist campaign, exclusionary populist campaign, and the encounter for the first time humanize the Muslim to the other. It reduces the fears. You discover that they have pain and suffering, vulnerability like you. It establishes a shared and common third identity. We, as this, or redefine the boundaries of in and out group based on citizenship. This weekend last week I was in Lisbon. An imam from Mozambique, Portuguese, 35 years in Lisbon, stood when 120 people in the room and says, we are Portuguese as much as one can be Portuguese. We are not from out, we are from within. They discover also in this encounter that Muslims and Islam have made a huge contribution to the current European civilization. And that way, the one who's fearful of Islam become less fearful. We're dealing with immunization against populism. How can you immunize community, discourse, narrative from populism? So we also, maybe last one action we do or deal with, strategy, we form an alliance for advocacy for common cause. Get the Muslim farmers to work with non-Muslim farmers, get environmental, women's rights, racism. All of these are common themes. Have the Muslim different organization engage in these activities with the community, even with the minimalist approach. It allows them to be perceived within. I will close with the last slide that in front of me, you can see it. So these are some of the things we do. The challenges. When we bring a European religious institution, some of the institutions themselves endorse populist leader, and they are very hesitant to go against populist leader to even join the encounter. Another challenge, Muslim leaders themselves. They're not convinced with interreligious dialogue, some of them not convinced to engage with policymakers as useful. Third, they lack the capacity of engagement itself, either language, processing, articulating what they want. Also, there is the historical burden. Try to get an Algerian French to speak about his historical victimhood and injury with the French colonial power in North Africa or with the British in Palestine and others. And the third source of challenge, that the policy and political system itself is antagonistic to religion. So for us to bring policymakers to the encounter, it becomes really very challenging. Finally, in a brief, interreligious peace building and dialogue is a way to debunk the myth spread and used by populist leaders that Islam and Muslims are here in Europe to destroy their way of life and threaten their existence. To do this debunking, the task requires both Muslim and non-Muslim in Europe to work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. That was great. We'll now go to our final speaker for this panel. Dr. Nahid Habibullah is our very own professor of sociology and social theory at the Arab American University of Palestine. Dr. Habibullah's research concentrates on sociology of religion, political sociology, and cultural sociology with a focus on the Middle East in general and Israel-Palestine in particular. Her publications have been featured in the Journal of Arab Studies Quarterly, as well as Jerusalem Quarterly, among others. Dr. Nahid will be presenting a paper titled The Diffusion of Religious Populism, a Challenge to Democracy. Dr. Nahid, tafadali. You are muted.
Thank you, Lana. Hi, everybody. I guess I'll just go right into it. The term populism carries with it a multitude of meanings. It was polarized, with populism on the right being seen as antithetical to democracy, and populism on the left perceived as a democratic tool that pushes the boundaries of elite control and ushers a possibility for the people to claim the right to govern themselves. The literature on populism today shows that in order to understand the sprouting of contemporary populism, there is a need to go beyond the two binary definitions. As will become evident, there are several definitions of populism, and those definitions are used as an analytical tool to study populism in its different forms and manifestations, whether it's a movement, a discourse, a style, or a form of governance. Populism is not a new phenomenon. What is striking in today's contemporary populism is its spread in democratic societies. A few reasons could explain this contemporary phenomena. Some are materialist, while others are spiritual and emotive. The material reasons stem from the citizens' sense of abandonment by the democratic state. They no longer feel represented by their political leaders who are elected to represent them. The economic gap between the rich and poor is widening, leaving many falling between the cracks. On the spiritual, emotive level, the accelerated development of technology since the turn of the century, with its disclosure to opportunities, but also to its endless transformation of societies as a result of connected global economy, porous boundaries, population shift through migration and refugees resettlement, has furthered the alienation and disenchantment of many and has resulted in the return to old and traditional values. Those are some of the main reasons which provide the context for the rise of populism. My emphasis in this part is on movements and regimes. Building on the literature on populism and the field of sociology of religion, I study religious populism as a subtype of populism. Even though religious populism shares many aspects with other types of populism, religion has a distinct character, which is its eschatological interpretation of life on earth. This distinct characteristic of religion makes it a lethal weapon in the arms of populists. I start by introducing some of the definitions and meanings of populism. I then explore the distinct aspect of religious populism. And lastly, I explore different challenges that religious populism pose to democracy. The main attribute of populism is its emphasis on the centrality of the people in a political process. Populism assumes the people as a homogeneous entity with similar concerns, needs, and aspirations. The main characteristics of populism is an appeal to the people and to popular sovereignty through a construction of a closed group that is the people, resulting in a construction of a part of the society as a representative of the whole. As a result, the empirical people or parts of it is idealized into a sacralized entity. Constructing the idealized people as the right people anticipates the friend-enemy distinction. Populism is a political project with an end goal to attain control of the democratic process through democratic means such as election, referendum, and so on. The role of a leader in populism is essential to the development and maturation of the populist movement. Erato provides a concise definition of the term, and here I quote, "Populism has a distinctive fourfold logic. It entails a pars pro toto dynamic through which the authentic part of population stands for the whole, an imaginary of the sovereign people as one, as an ideal unity, a friend-enemy conception of politics, and an embodiment model of representation," end quote. Populism is performative, where the public space is perceived as a space for contestation and instigating change. It is of the democratic process. Populist actors and leaders utilize the democratic process and the democratic platforms for promoting, disseminating, and rallying behind their ideas for the sake of getting to power. sorry. Populism utilizes the democratic apparatus of the state to create a reality where a certain definition of the people is established, while at the same time limiting the rights, access, and resources to those who are deemed as outsiders or not part of the constructed people. The scholarship on populism has disclosed the complexity of the term the people. And here I build on Canovan's definition. The people as a unit of analysis is malleable and carries with it a multitude of meanings. For one, the people means the nation, acquiring as a result a conservative appeal. The people in this definition means the political community of the nation, in the sense of an ethnos, with a clear demarcation of who is part of the membership community and who is an outsider. In the second definition of the people, the term is more confined as it conflates the people with the underdog and is put in opposition with the elite, who are the privileged majority. The third definition implies the people in general and could mean individual human beings at large. Thus, it is clear that the people is a construction. In populism, the construction of the collective comes in two dimensions, the vertical and horizontal dimensions. And here I build on Brubaker's conception of populism. In the vertical dimension, the people is constructed in relation to an elite. The elite are framed as a group endowed with social and cultural capital, which allows them to accumulate wealth, status, and political clout. Their living conditions are remarkably different from the rest of the people, who construe them as privileged and at times even corrupt, with their own interests in mind. The elite is perceived as an alien group that share different values, habits, and way of life that is distinctly different from the people. Additionally, the elite is to blame, amongst other things, for the unequal distribution of resources, where they are blamed for privileging some marginalized and undeserving groups over the general good of the people. In the horizontal dimension, the people are transformed into a bounded community with marked boundaries delineating the inside group and the outside group. Social classifications are numerous and could be based on cultural affiliations, religious, ethnic, or national. In right-wing populism, the bounded community is constructed as a cultural or ethnic bounded collectivity with shared beliefs and way of life. Those who are excluded from this membership community are those who are perceived by the in-group as outsiders. Thus, a populist discourse builds a tight discursive interweaving of both the vertical and the horizontal dimensions and constructs an image of the people in opposition to the elite on top and the internal outsiders, outsider communities living within the bounded contours of the nation state. Conversely, the elite are perceived as aiding and abetting the erasure of the distinct character of the people through an integration of those outsiders into the state system. The elites are incriminated in providing preferential treatment to those groups at the expense of the legitimate people. Accordingly, the people become the symbolic representation of the real and the authentic and situates itself in opposition to the other. The other, in this case, could be an amalgamation of horizontal and vertical distinctions where the elite and the other come to form the enemy of the populist group. As mentioned above, populist sentiments and movements are empowered by the presence of a charismatic leader who speaks in the name of the people and is supported by the people. The role of the leader is essential, especially if the movement aspires to be part of the political regime or of the political game first. Populist leaders are oftentimes charismatic leaders, and here I quote Canavan who states charismatic leaders who can make politics personal and immediate instead of being remote and bureaucratic. The definition of the citizenry into real and fake becomes the defining mark of the political battle launched by the populist leader in the name of the people. Once such a rhetoric is adopted by a populist leader, the citizenry and the political process is no longer perceived as a contest between opposing groups, but a war between enemies. Once the populist leader establishes his or her credibility to his or her followers, conflict is generated in the society and the pool of citizenry is divided along the distinction of friend and enemy, where the friend is the real people who are portrayed as rightful, legitimate, and authentic, while the enemy are those who are perceived as illegitimate, outsiders, and imposters. As noted by Erato and Cohen, through making a distinction between friend and foe, the empirical people are extracted from the contamination. A successful populist leader builds on several ideologies, from a political discourse that caters to his/her representation of the people. In contemporary populism, religion plays a vital role in the friend and enemy distinction. The field of sociology of religion differentiates between two definitions of religion. The first definition examines religion in its cultural manifestations in the social and cultural spaces. The literature on this topic examines how religious interpretations and teachings inform our social world and creates different social groups. In this sense, it resembles Durkheim's definition of religion as values and practices that are constantly reified by its adherents. It is this reification through collective rituals which provide legitimation and cohesion of the group. In the second definition, religion is defined as an ideology, a world vision that builds on the presence of a transcendental God. The way that a community lives in the world is informed in relation to the world to come. The laws of God are the binding social contract, and they construct the world through a religious outlook. Religion is an important tool in contemporary populism. Religious populism capitalizes on a specific interpretation of religion and utilizes it in sculpting a discourse that is both populist and religious. And here I quote Yilmaz, who states, populism itself seems to resemble fundamentalist interpretation of religion, as it sacralizes the people and their will and promise salvation if they follow a particular leader, end quote. In order to understand why contemporary populism relies on religious symbolic representation, we need to examine this phenomena in social, political, global context. The definition of religion outlined above discloses two possibilities of its integration in populist movements. The first as a subset value among other values, which I define as cultural religious populism, and the second as the value which guides this discourse, style, and identity of the populist movement, and this I define as ideological religious populism. In the former, religion is presented as part of a construction of a group's culture, with its historical trajectories as well as social, political, and economic transformation. Thus, this understanding of religion assumes what Brubaker defines as civilizational. In the cultural modality, a possibility for cohabitation of different values relies on the compatibility of the political goals. This modality assumes weak solidarity amongst members of the movements, since their alliance is not necessarily based on ideological compatibility, but rather a marriage of interest. The role of the leader is essential as she constructs a populist discourse that addresses the needs of the different subsets. This assumes a secular interpretation of the role of religion in modern societies. on the premises that religion is one worldview amongst many. In cultural religious populism, the markers of distinction that a populist movement would adopt would be in relation to values and codes found in the society, our way of life as opposed to their way of life. Brubaker defines this distinction as civilizational as it builds not only on religion, but also on a historical discursive tradition which consolidates the opposing entities in relation to history, way of life, or worldviews. As a result, populists construct a discourse that incorporates religion to other values such as race, history, ethnicity, and etc. Contextualizing religion through a cultural interpretation allows populists to translate religious terms to more secular ones. This serves two purposes. On the one hand, religious differences are marked and become an integral part in the consolidation of the legitimate people through a plethora of values. On the other hand, taking a cultural understanding to religion allows populist movements in general and the populist leader in particular to widen his base of supporters to include not only a religious category, but other cultural categories of who is the people, thus including other values which could be racial, ideological, or geographic. In ideological religious populism, the religious distinction is purely ideological and rests mainly on certain interpretation of a religion or a religious text. This modality is defined as ideational according to Brubaker. It sees religion as a way of life. As such, it refuses the modern understanding of the role of religion as marginal, private, one amongst many other worldviews. In this modality, religious populist movements are informed by their interpretation of the religious script. Their construction of the people adheres more closely to a religious conception of the virtuous people, with the populist leader represented as a sacred figure who is the embodiment of the people. And here we can see the resemblance of this type of religious populism to fundamentalism. In this model, the political is based on a theological interpretation, and as a result, assumes its legitimacy from the laws of God and not mundane worldly laws. Such movements, once empowered and in office, may reject the democratic system altogether and adopt a system that represents their version of governing. This model is in stark contradiction with democracy, since the people and their leader do not wholly represent all the citizens, but a pars pro toto, and the laws that are decreed could be acceptable to the majority in power, but forced onto the rest. Religion and populism adheres to—
5-minute warning, Dr. Nahed. 5-minute warning.
I'm finishing. Religion and populism adhere to some principles. For one, all monotheistic religions define the people through the prism of religious affiliations. Thus, the construction of the people in the religious populist sense would be based on giving preferential treatment to adherents of the adopted religion. Such an action by a populist government is in clear conflict with the democratic ethos. All monotheistic religion assumes a sovereign whose role is to lead his followers to salvation. This hierarchy becomes easier to translate if the populist leader is perceived as a savior whose role is to lead his followers to salvation. The imagery is familiar and builds on the traditional historical role that religious leaders play as representatives of God on earth. As mentioned above, religious populism distinguishes between the people, pars pro toto, who are the legitimate members of the state, and the outsiders who are imposed on the people. This distinction takes on a sacred identity when the people are perceived as the righteous people who are good and are present on earth to defend the word of God. This religious populist discourse breaks altogether from the democratic enterprise as the idea of membership in the state becomes tied with religious affiliation, which discriminates between members of the polis on the basis of their faith. The friend and enemy distinctions which informs populist project finds plenty of reference in the religious text. The friend-enemy polarity takes a transcendental appeal through its translation to the saved and damned, or the righteous and evil. This allows for a possibility to consolidate the opposing entities of the citizenry into the good, righteous people and the evil people, and as a result see the other as a malignant growth that needs total eradication, and as a result creating a community that rests on animosity and not opposition. Additionally, this definition of membership polarizes the pool of citizenry on the basis of good and evil, which would create a challenge to democracy if the state acts in the name of the righteous to crush those who are perceived as outsiders. The threat to democracy is inevitable when the pool of citizenry is divided along those lines, as the whole political enterprise is transformed from a democratic exercise of governing to a battlefield between the righteous and the enemies of God. The field of sociology of religion outlines the complexity of the cohabitation of religion and democracy in governance. On the one hand, those who consent to the secularization theory and the privatization of religion argue that some religious teachings are undemocratic, as they don't adhere to the idea of equality of all citizens, regardless of their gender, race, and age. On the other hand, those who reject secularization theory and the exclusion of religion in governance claim that this exclusion is culturally and historically specific and should not be imposed on all religions and social communities. Thus, it is safe to assume that once a religious populist is in power, it will oppose this restriction to the integration of religious teaching in governance on the premise that a transcendental law is superior to a mundane human law. In a religious populist model, the prohibition to construct a system of governance on the teaching of God would be rejected altogether, as it negates their ideology and their conviction of the centrality of religious laws to the social condition. Consequently, once a religious populist form of governance is enshrined, it will inevitably infringe on the rights and freedoms of individuals and communities who don't necessarily accept this ideology or this interpretation for that matter. Most importantly, a religious populist form of governance may choose not to represent itself as a democracy, but to define itself through a different system of governance. The heterogeneity of the pool of citizenry in contemporary societies pose a nuisance to a homogeneous understanding of the pool of the people as a society, which is, as the society is made up of diverse individuals who adhere to a multitude of ideologies and convictions that may not necessarily align with a religious perception of reality. Suppressing the rights and freedoms of such groups infringe on a democratic enterprise. Evidently, populist interpretation of religion would see the legitimacy of constructing one's life and community through religion, and would reject a worldly manuscript that compares poorly to a transcendental teaching. This conviction becomes even stronger when those communities have lost faith in a democratic system. To conclude, just like any other form of populism, religious populism employs the democratic apparatus for its benefit, and once in control, deflates those democratic institutions to ensure that the populist reign endures. I argue that populism with a religious conviction may produce not only a hollowification of the democratic apparatus as such, but also to the questioning of the democratic reasoning altogether, and as a result, challenging the democratic process's credibility, and alternately, once in power, acts on sabotaging the democratic enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nahed. I want to remind all of our attendees and panelists, if anyone would like to ask a question, you could either raise your hand or submit a question in the chat box on the bottom of the screen. Dr. Nadia Orbatani, go ahead.
Thank you. I like very much Nahed's presentation because in my view, and perhaps everybody can agree on that, as you said, the connections between populism and religion can be very toxic. Toxic because religion is itself an engine of faith, and populism lives out of faith. It doesn't want simply trust the leader. He wants faith. And that's identification, because faith is identification. So the question that I'm asking you is whether, according to you, a country that has a more homogeneous religious-based population, if this country is more exposed to, or instead, pluralism itself can challenge because the majority religion can use the identification of religion in order to repress the minority. That is, in both cases, according to you, is similar, the relationship between populism or religion, or instead, a pluralist, more than one religion is different from a mono-religious country. I'm sorry if I don't know whether I was clear.
Shall I answer? Or?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think a homogeneous society would make it less of a challenge, I would think. But then on the other hand, I mean, what's a homogeneous society? So even if we are talking, and this is something that has been recurring throughout the 2 days or 3 days of the conference, that it's not relevant to our case. But in many ways, I think we are in this reality, in this new social condition as a result of globalization, of interaction. And I would think that you don't really have a homogeneous society. And in that sense, even if there is, you know, like all Palestinians, it would still be problematic. But I think, I mean, the whole thing, I'm fascinated with religion on so many different levels. And I think because of our situation as well, and the centrality of religion, I guess, to the Palestinian-Israeli question, raises also another level. And here with the example of Israel, which is always in the back of my mind, which also constructed itself as a homogeneous entity, as this safe haven for all Jews. But on the other hand, who are the Jews? And in that sense, it also, even within the Israeli society, and this is what I'm trying to get my head around. Like once you have and for that reason, I think populist religious movement becomes more appropriate to understand this situation, because with populism, you have a certain discourse, a narrative that is constructed, and there's no way for other people who believe in religion in a different way to interpret it as they please and still be accepted into this populist framework. So in that sense, it also provides this challenge. I'm sorry, I don't know if I really answered your question. I'm still battling with it, but yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Nahed. We'll go to the next question. Dr. Raed Abu Badawiya, تفضل.
شكرا لنا. بس حبيت يعني أفهم شوي ليش هالقد ضروري وجود الليدرشيب في موضوع الدين والشعبوية دكتور ناهد، خاصة إنه في فراسة يعني نموذج معين في فلسطين تحديدا. بتذكر أيام الانتخابات التشريعية الفلسطينية الأولى، القيادة حماس ما كانت تروج كثير على موضوع يعني عدم الدخول للانتخابات، بينما القيادة ما كانت تروج، بينما القاعدة الشعبية حماس كانت تروج على هذا الموضوع. يعني ما احتاجت القيادة، الحركة ما احتاجت قيادتها للترويج الشعبوي لمسألة عدم الدخول للانتخابات التشريعية. بعرفش إذا أنا فاهم صح أو لا. هل في ضرورة عن جد لوجود قيادة ولا لا؟
يعني بتخيل إنه في ضرورة للقيادة من الأساس، يعني علشان يصير في قوة لهاي الحركة إنه يصير لها صوت سياسيا. يعني من هاي الناحية أنا بتخيل إنه في أهمية للقيادة. هلا مش شرط إنه على كل أكشن إنه القيادة تكون موجودة، بس بتخيل يعني باللحظة اللي بيصير في تجسيد للفكر تبع هاي المجموعة من خلال الفرد القائد، يعني بيصير في بسهولة للعملية إنه تصير عملية سياسية. بس here I also won't mind, I mean, if Andrew or Carlos would like to chip in relation to the relation of leadership.
ننتقل للسؤال الثاني. دكتور أيمن يوسف تفضل.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lana. I have 3 remarks. The first one goes to Dr. Erato. I enjoyed your presentation, Dr. Erato. In the modern liberal democratic form of government in the West, what I sensed, I felt from your presentation that the populists have more space of exploiting and utilizing power, authority and constitution in a presidential form of democracy more than in the parliamentary form of democracy. That was, my initial, understanding from your presentation. Is the presidential form of democracy is more friendly with populists than, democratic form, than parliamentary form of democracy, although we have check and balances and separation of power and other democratic instruments. And my second remark to الملاحظة الثانية للدكتور خالد، شعبوية الاستعمار. ما أنت دائما بتساهم في خلق، تعرف هذا المثقف القلق، أنت دائما هذه الأمور الانقلابية، وإحنا بنحب هذا الطرح دكتور خالد، شعبوية المستعمر وشعبية المقاومة. من السياق الفلسطيني إذا لاحظت في المعركة الأخيرة على غزة، الشعبوية اللي اندمجت مع النضال ومع الدين، الخطاب الشعبوي الفلسطيني ما كان موجه ضد الاحتلال بقدر ما كان موجه داخلي. احنا عملنا عمليه تناقض. الخطاب الشعبوي الفلسطيني سواء من الضفه او من غزه كان موجه فلسطينيا اكثر ما كان موجه باتجاه الاحتلال والاستعمار والمركز الرأسمالي، وبالتالي في تناقضات داخليه بنيويه على الساحه الفلسطينيه. جيد انه نفهمها هذا من المنظور الشعبوي. واخيرا انا اسف ان طولت دكتور ابو نمر. I was really pleased to meet you in Germany. You are most welcome to this presentation. From your talk, I guess when you are bringing religious leaders and secular leaders around one table, I sense that might spark a new type of populism, half secular and half religious. I have that fear. Sometimes even we can get apart without have a common positive result from this kind of dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ayman. Before we go to answering these questions, do you guys mind if I read 2 more questions from the audience so that we answer the questions as a group? Is that okay? I'm going to go ahead and read a question from Mr. Hussam Hamid. who asks, advancing a radical approach against populism might generate more harm than good. The debates till now don't identify who are the actors that at the domestic and external level can try to deal with the populism challenge. What is populism? Is populism enough? And then a question from Mr. Yahya Qawood. يخبرني التاريخ بأن الكثير من التيارات وحتى الدول توظف الدين لتحقيق رغباتها وإن كأنها غير متدينين المحافظين الجدد في عهد سابق. اليوم في الغرب توظف بعض الأحزاب والتيارات الشعبوية الدين من أجل الالتفاف جماهيري حول أفكارهم ووصولهم للسلطة. كيف يمكن الرد بأن الأديان تدعو للتسامح وليس العداء للآخر? Yeah, that's the question. Excuse my Arabic. Dr. Khalid Hroub, and then followed by Dr. Erato, we could answer these questions.
اوكي. يعني نبدا بيحيى. يحيى سؤالك معقد لكن ما عنده جواب صراحه. يعني بالاخير الاديان مثل اي شيء اخر، يعني مثل السياره مثل المي ممكن تستخدمها تروح فيها على الشغل، ممكن تدعس فيها واحد، فلذلك هي يعني متوفره للتوظيف للاستخدام لاساءه الاستخدام. بعتقد ممكن تكون يعني مثل ما تفضل الدكتور محمد يعني سالفيشنال هيك يعني وانسبيريشنال اذا بدك انستتيوشن ولا نظام اجتماعي، ممكن تكون نظام قتل حسب المستخدم. لكن الدكتور ايمن يعني سؤال مهم، انه هذه شعبويه المقاومه، يعني ما بعرف دقه التوصيف، انه كانت صح موجهه المقاومه هذا الخطاب كان موجه داخلي، لكن عمليا كان داخلي وخارجي، لانه كان يحاول ان يركز على مركزيه المقاومه، لانه في السياق الفلسطيني في صراع بين فكرتين، فكره مثلا او منهجين، منهج المقاومه بحسب ما ترى حماس، ومنهج مثلا المفاوضات مش عارف شو كما ترى اوسلو فالخطاب كان والخطابين موجهين نحو كيفيه التعامل مع المحتل في السياق الكولونيالي، اما مفاوضاتي واما مقاوماتي. فعمليا كان صح انه هو شعبويه مبين انها داخليا، لكن هي في النهايه الاستهداف هو المحتل في نهايه هذا. لكن في عندي ملاحظتين ثلاثه على بقيه الزملاء يعني بسرعه، نص دقيقه او اقل. الاخ محمد ذكر الانكليفز اوف مسلمز في يوروب، وهذا مرة كتبت أنا موضوع عن هذا الشيء، لكن استخدمت كلمة ثانية ممكن تكون ما بعرف، ما بدي أحكي إنها أدق، لكن على الأقل مطروح هذا. سميت أنا communicational ghettos، لأنه لما تحكي enclave يعني there is an assumption إنه كأنهم بيعيشوا في مكان واحد في neighborhood، لكن عمليا وأنا عشت في أوروبا فترة هذا وبعرف إنه لا، ممكن يكونوا المسلمين مثلا في لندن في باريس مش عارف في بروسلز يعيشوا هذا، لكن ممكن يكونوا موزعين. لكن الجيتو جاي كوميونيكيشنال، بمعنى إنه ممكن تعيش أنت وجنبك جارك بريطاني ولا فرنسي، لكن على مستوى الكوميونيكيشن أنت بتطلع على الجزيرة ولا بتطلع على العربية أو بتطلع على تلفزيونك الوطني الجزائري وبتحكي تليفون بالسوشيال ميديا مع صاحبك ولا مع امك، حتى بتعرف شو طبخت اليوم في فلسطين، وبعدين انت على الواتساب جروب في العربي مع هذا. فانت في بابل يعني، حتى لو كانوا كل جيرانك اوروبيين. فاحنا صاير الجيتو بطل فيزيكال زي ما كان الجوش جيتو، الان صار كوميونيكيشنال. واي ثينك انه ممكن يعطي شويه انريتشنس للمقصود في انه انكليف. احيانا بيكونوا yes they live in physical enclaves، بس احيانا ثاني بيكون لا. الدكتوره ناديه سالت ناهد انه religious populism could be used مثلا اذا كان homogeneous society could be used against مثلا other religious minoritarian هيك religious groups. انا I think انه يمكن اكون غلطان، لكن I think المشكله كمان بالريليجيوس populism جايه انه يستخدم وانه mobilization not necessarily against the other religious minorities. against non-religious مثلا ولا secular ولا whatever kind of national rivals. يعني مش هو بيستخدم هذا الشعبوية الدينية ضد دين ثاني. عندنا بفلسطين مش موجود مثلا دين ثاني الصتش انه مستحق هذا، لكن بتصير الشعبوية الدينية انه هو بيستخدمها ضد الفصيل الوطني اللي هو بيشوفه انه علماني او ملحد او مش متدين والى اخره. فهنا ممكن يكون في خطورة مثلا من نوع آخر. آخر واحدة اللي هي سألها أيضا دكتور رائد أبو بدوية حول إنه هل بحاجة إحنا لليدرشيب حتى يكون في populism. سؤال مهم وأنا يمكن سألته بتذكر في الكينوت سبيكر، إنه ممكن تكون عندك ايديا بس فكرة معينة هي كانت تشتغل دور الليدرشيب، لكن في هذه الحالة تحديدا، لأنه أنا كتبت كتاب عن حماس يمكن، إنه في هذه الحالة تحديدا الانتخابات الأولى 1996 كان موقف القيادة إنها ما تدخل في الانتخابات، وشغلت القاعدة وشغلت المفتين إنه أنتوا اشتغلوا في الموضوع، أما أنا أوفيشالي ما راح أطلع قرار يعني وأعمل موبيلايزيشن ضد الانتخابات. فهذا إذن هو قرار قيادة، حتى لو بدأ إنه قرار مش قيادة لكنه بشكل غير مباشر، يعني كأنها سياسة براغماتية، إنه القيادة موجودة هي اتخذت قرار، مش أنا اللي راح أنفذ، القاعدة اللي راح تنفذ. فبهذه الحالة تحديدا كان هو قرار، كانت القيادة موجودة يعني فول فليجد يعني بالموضوع، لكن السؤال بظل قائم وعنده I think عنده شرعية إنه هل نحتاج في كل حالات الشعبوية قيادة ولا لا. شكرا لكم.
شكرا. Dr. Erato.
Am I next?
Yes, you are. Can you hear us?
I can hear you great.
It's your.
Well, you know, one thing is when one participates with so many excellent participants that one, in the end, comment also on the others. Actually, in this case, the fact that I agree so much with Mohammed Abu Nimr and with Nahid Habiballah saves me that effort, because I just agree with all the things that they have said, and I found it excellent. Of course, unluckily, there is someone I do disagree with, and that's Mr. Rube, Professor Rube. Answer the question that was addressed to me, that's the easy part. We all used to think on the basis of Latin American experiences that presidentialism key, because that's the direct elect of the people. Marx, Tocqueville already described this really well in the 19th century, correctly, for Bonaparte, the two Bonapartes, in fact, the two Napoleons. And so we used to think that that's the form. And here my country came into the rescue, namely Hungary, because it has shown the world that parliamentarism is quite capable of producing also a form of plebiscitary political leadership. Max Weber actually anticipated this, because he spoke about Gladstone in this way and some other tribunes of the people. And I think that he turned out to be right, in spite of the overwhelming empirical evidence to the contrary, which supports you, Professor Hyman. So now we, of course, see it in Hungary and even Turkey, where, interestingly enough, it's midway. Erdogan used the prime ministership to generate his religious populist challenge, but he makes you right too, because he converted it to a presidential system. Orban does not want to do that in Hungary. And Kaczynski, most interestingly, is not even prime minister, but is doing it from behind. So that, I think you will agree with what I just said, because these are purely empirical matters. And it still means you're right. The presidential thing is still a real key. And Marx and Tocqueville, I said that I'm very much like classical social theory. Marx and Tocqueville were usually right on most things. And they were right on this as well. And they were not the only ones, of course. who in the 90s focused on Bonapartism, presidentialism, and so on. Now, now comes the part of disagreement. I think that what Professor Roop produces is a valid narrative. It's a narrative from a particular view. It is the Palestinian narrative, or at least the framework within which different Palestinians find themselves. And I think there's good reason to support. I don't think myself that it was the Germans and the English who produced this primarily. It makes the colonial thesis a little bit neater because they were the colonial powers. But I think that though they played a role, for example, the role of the mandate is a very, it would not be easy to prove what you're trying to prove, that the mandatory power produced this particular outcome that we have today, or even 48. So to put it all on the back of them is easy enough. I think, you know, I don't like Britain and the British Empire one bit. I have no interest in it, don't like them. I wouldn't want to defend them. But here, the case is very much more complex. And I think people here who know the history will know that. Now, the problem for you is that the Zionists have a very too. And it's not your narrative, it's their narrative. And they're good at storytelling, by the way. They got a good story. You got a good story. And the question is, isn't our job to become self-critical toward our own stories now? That's the question. Because story, and with their story, the only thing you got is force, which will decide between the two of you. I hate to tell you that right now that does not put the Palestinians in an advantageous position, that particular diagnosis. So if force decides, neither do I like force, A, and B, in this case, I don't think it's the right strategy. And your narrative leads to it. It leads to it. It leads to nothing else. Now, where I do is a combined Jewish-Arab effort to transform the region. That's where I want to go. And that effort has a critically on both sides. And I think that that means we have to become more critical to our own narratives. And that goes for them. I was never a Zionist. It goes for them too. But it goes for you. So to repeat this story the way you tell it produces bad things. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Erato. We'll continue this discussion during the roundtable. I'm going to give Dr. Mohammed Abu Nimr 2 minutes to respond. I do want to give you guys a few minutes to take a break.
Thank you, Lina. I thought you were going to give me 2 minutes to resolve this this interesting response from Dr. Erato to Dr. Khalid Hroub, because clearly the asymmetric power relation was missed in that conversation, and there was no equation between the two stories here. But let me respond to what I said about Dr. Saif. Dr. Saif, thank you for the note. When we bring people together, secular and religious, it cannot produce a populist response, because the assumption we use are assumption of social justice, of equality, of basic human rights for all people around the table, with the notion that whether they are secular, Muslim, Christian, they are facing one common challenge, whether it is environment or whether it is whatever it is, or kosher, halal issues in Europe. Jews and Muslims have the same problem of religious freedom in many ways in Europe. And when we bring them together, despite their deep animosity, we are able to produce a joint narrative as long as we avoid dealing with Palestine. But we focus on the common issues that they can work on together. But I also wanted to say, from yesterday and today, I must say that sometimes we speak in Arabic, Sha'bawi, Shu'ubi, and sometimes I get the notion that we forget that the populist movement is based on exclusion. And the act of exclusion can be internal and can be external. A Muslim leader can be exclusivist, exclusionary against Shia, against Baha'i, against Sufi, as well as he or she can be also exclusionist against Jews or against Christians and other. And there is plenty of these exclusionary policies and statements and campaign that people have done. And finally, thank you, Dr. Khalid. You proposed the communication, but I thank you. I think it's a good direction in terms of the enclave, but I was speaking not only of residential enclave, it's also mental and social. Mental and social enclave, where, as you said, بتدخن أرجيلة وبتحلق شعرك وبتروح عند اللحام وبتروح تاكل حمص وفلافل all in 24 hours, and they all Arab or Muslim, and you have not come in any touch with anyone who's a non-Muslim. So you have mental enclave. That mental enclave took your entire energy through the day, and you did not interact with those who might be prone and receptive to populism. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohammed Abu Nimer. I want to give everyone 5 minutes to at least take a break. During the roundtable, Dr. Nahid Habibullah will be moderating. I do want to remind you guys, we have another question from the audience asking our panelists to define populism, if that's even possible. But they asked that multiple times, so I just wanted to remind you of that. Thank you all. We'll reconvene at 7:20. Is that okay?
Yes, yes. Can I say hi to Raf Zrayk? I haven't seen him in years. Well, كيف حالك يا ولد? Thank you.
All right,
So we're back in 5 minutes, right?
Yes, 7:20. 5 minutes. All right, thank you all.
Go. Take those things out. Take them out. How'd it go?
Nahid was very good. I think one sociologist is very good, and this guy. How do you prove what?
مرحبا دكتور أيمن.
تحيات أهل اليرولا.
أمور تمام عندك؟
الحمد لله كل شيء تمام. الدكتور محمد أبو نمر أيمن سيف عاد أيمن يوسف. أوكي.
أبدعت يا دكتور.
الله يرضى عليك. الدكتور محمد كأنه طلع هو دكتور محمد أبو نمر.
مش عارفة. إيه.
أوكي نبقى نودي له منيحة. نعم. أوكي بنحكي ولا إن شاء الله.
أوكي.
Back for some more punishment.
I know it'll be an interesting discussion, that's for sure.
Yeah, you don't know me, but I'm always very provocative.
I like that. I like that.
Nahid knows this.
That's what we love about you.
Yeah, you know the story about the tarantula and the mouse swimming across the river, and the tarantula who's riding on a mouse stings the mouse, and they both sink, and the mouse says, we both sink, what are you doing? And the tarantula says, it's in my nature.
Right. Right.
And you know, it's in my nature. I can't possibly go past a conference, any conference, without doing this. So I did it. But I think, you know, for me, my point of view, at least it was right. So that's the issue. I don't do it just, you know, around issues I don't think I believe in. I do it around things I believe in. But we'll talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's very timely for the roundtable. It'll be interesting to hear both perspectives for sure.
Right, right.
So shall we start, or?
Yeah.
Shall I wait for the rest, or?
Should we wait just a few minutes just until their cameras are on, maybe?
Yeah.
مسموع ولا لا صوت يا جماعة؟
مسموع.
رجع حق الصوت يسلم.
Dr. Nahid, I would go ahead and start if you're.
Yeah. Okay, so welcome back, and this is our final and concluding session of this year's conference. Thank you all for being a very active members in this conference. Before we start, and this is the topic of this roundtable is mainly looking at the ramification of populism in relation to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So I would just like to lay out a few like the context before we start the discussion. And I would like to differentiate between two factors that has affected the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or I guess situation, political situation. And one, I think of it as more external, and the other one as internal. So for the external factors, and here I want to emphasize on the US mainly, and mainly the US under Trump, to be more specifically, and the challenges that were posed as a result of Trump's term in office, which produced some irreversible damaging to addressing the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And here, the first point that I would like to raise is Trump's declaration that Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel, and his orders to move the embassy to Jerusalem is clearly motivated by his appeals to his religious popular base. He declared that Jerusalem is no longer on the negotiating table, and this move is antithetical to previous actions taken by all US presidents, not to mention that it's in clear violation to all international agreements and UN resolutions. The other step that I would like to emphasize, or action that he took, was that he exerted pressure on some Arab countries to sign the Abraham Accords, which resulted in isolating the Palestinian people and their representatives from their longtime historical allies and strip them from any means to exert pressure on the state of Israel. On the internal level, and here I differentiate between the Israeli and the Palestinian scene. So on the Israeli scene, the populist government of Netanyahu becoming more empowered by the US populist discourse, which was the style par excellence of the previous Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The other component is the populist actions acquiring a normative status, which was clearly manifested in the state's action toward the Palestinian citizens of Israel as their rights and freedoms were restrained. The state's support to right-wing Zionist populist violations against Palestinians was documented in several incidents during the May upheavals, where different institutions of the state exerted different methods to survey, control, and threaten the Palestinian citizens of the state. Now, on the Palestinian front, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, we have a Palestinian leadership that is polarized. The Palestinian Authority discredited by many Palestinians as a result of Trump's actions, which strengthened the conviction that the peace process is no longer relevant. And the third component is that the PA leadership perceived by many as a detached elite group who do not represent the people. So maybe I'll just ask a few questions and then we can start the discussion. So, here goes. The first one, what are the paths available to both Palestinians and Israelis within such a context? What are the populist manifestations on the conflict, and how do you see it shaping the direction of the conflict? And lastly, do you think the literature on populism would be a good research tool to analyze and research the topic? And here I open it for discussion. And I mean, we can start with one, or I'll just get some ideas from you. Dr. Khaled Lehroub, would you like to start? We can't hear you. مش عم نسمعك, muted.
Yes, thank you very much. In fact, I wanted, if you allow me, to take maybe 1 minute or two to continue with Dr. Erato on his welcoming disagreement with me, because this is a part of, I think, part of the debate as well, because I didn't really quite understand the point of disagreement. He mentioned the British mandate or something like this, and I didn't.
Let's stick to the topic. I mean, maybe we can discuss it after. I mean, if it's relevant to the discussion. And here I would also like to welcome Dr. Raf Zrayk. I don't know if many of you know him. Sorry, Raf. So Dr. Raf Zrayk received his PhD from Harvard Law School. He is a jurist and a scholar, an expert in political philosophy and the philosophy of law. He is a lecturer on property law and the theory of law at Ono Academic College, academic co-director of Minerva Humanities Center at Tel Aviv University, and he is a senior research fellow at Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. His research addresses questions pertaining to legal and political theory and issues of citizenship and identity, Zionism and Palestinian question. Okay, so let's start. How do you see the populist context presenting itself on the Israeli-Palestinian scene? We can speak, I mean, if you're comfortable in speaking in Arabic, we do have the translation. Okay, let's start. Andrew, do you?
And now you can hear me.
Yes.
Well, I have no doubt of the relevance of this topic, and it's for external and internal reasons. The external is that we are living in an epoch in which a socioeconomic time, the neoliberal one has entered into crisis. And what form that crisis takes in different places is different, but nevertheless, one can see populist responses to it as one of the possible ways of trying to deal with that crisis, because whatever that crisis means, it means that the representation in terms of the way liberal democratic regimes are organized, not to speak of your situation without liberal democratic regimes, representation is everywhere in trouble. And so populism will be a possible response. It can be in the name of different ideologies, different host ideologies, but it will likely to happen in all places. And so in this sense, your region, this double reality, Israel, Palestine, the Holy Land, is obviously touched by. But secondly, there are internal reasons. And that internal reason, and I'm certainly willing to accept the idea that, Carlos and I spoke about this yesterday, that almost every populism is also a struggle for national sovereignty. And that national sovereignty issue for the Palestinians is so burning that different responses to it are likely to be given. And in this particular epoch in which populism is also often the form, it's not so surprising. Now, I don't want to go into all descriptions. I think the Palestinian movement have had many political tendencies, even varieties of Marxism and anti-imperialism. It had also always had some liberal democratic components, and it had nationalist components as well. I would say bordering on fascism, but I don't want to get into a polemical issue like that. In any case, and I would say the situation in Israel too, contrary to what you naturally assume, has been a context in which there was a heterogeneity of political projects from the 30s on, some of them liberal democratic, some of them very leftist, some of them politically nationalist, and even, of course, they had a stronger dose of fascism, I would say, than you did. That is, fascism has been more present in that context. Think about the Stern gang, for example, which was clearly a fascist formation. So you have had all these tendencies, and now we're in a situation in which, first of all, there's an international, Trump illustrates that international stimulus given to a populist emergence from within these alternatives. And secondly, the deadlock itself leads to that. And it leads also to myth-making on both sides. And I think that politically, we should be very concerned about this. And one of the ways of being concerned is being self-critical. And that means that on both sides, one should criticize one's reigning narratives so that a kind of interaction between the two sides becomes possible. Thank you.
Thank you. So I mean, I guess maybe to just make it a little bit more clear in terms of the discussion. So if we are talking about those two entities, one, and for me, I think what is really concerning, and for that reason, I think with both situations or with both entities, the Palestinians and Israelis, getting more involved in this kind of populist discourse. And it is not only in relation to each other, but I think also in relation to the citizenry. And in that sense, I think it is also concerning. So maybe we should just start with trying to maybe talk about the Palestinian context and then the Israeli, and maybe from there try to see what possibilities would emerge for a different kind of discourse, I guess. Would Dr. Dalal, would you like to give us your point of view on the
just one sentence before, very rightly, someone said that the two populations shouldn't be equalized because one occupies the other. And I agree with that criticism. Certainly, Mala, or you have settlement.
Yeah, but I was thinking that maybe we should set the ground. So at least look at all the challenges that are found in the Palestinian context, and the actions that are taken with the populist ones, and how they are in making the situation worse, or what ways would be available for a possibility to change the scenario. Dr. Dalal, would you like to chip in?
Sure, thank you. And thanks to everyone for the very enlightening thoughts on populism. But to build on your question regarding if what are the paths available when it comes to populism, and also building on Professor Erato's definition about populism being a struggle for national sovereignty. Well, I was just thinking, when it comes to applying populism to the practical context in Palestine and Israel, I cannot but think of the populist narrative that is adopted not only on the Palestinian side, but also on the Israeli side. And here I want to share maybe a more specific case of, if we all recall, Gantz, the defense minister, came to Ramallah a couple of weeks ago, and he promised to pledge Abbas and the Palestinian Authority some 500 million shekels. Well, in this context, it is worth noting that soon after the pandemic erupted, Israel also promised to aid the PA by giving it 800 million shekel grant. But of course, it never did so. And this, I think, and many analysts also had argued that it could be the price of populism. While you want to keep some kind of balance of somehow containing violence, and you want to do it through some confidence building measures, maybe, but so at one hand, Israel is deducting money from the Palestinian tax transfers due to the public pressures against the PA's payments to the Palestinian prisoners and the families of the martyrs. And on the other hand, it is again forced to provide grants or loans to the Palestinians in order for the PA not to collapse. So here I'm just thinking about how populism is affecting the political narrative. If I don't know how to put it scientifically speaking, but I'm just thinking about what we hear from some Israeli officials, and then what we hear on the Palestinian side, and the dilemmas that those leaders must be going through. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Iyad, would you like to talk Okay, Lana, I'm not sure how it goes. I mean,
I'll jump in.
I was thinking of going around, but then if you don't feel like you have something to say, so maybe I'll just wait for the raise of hand. So we'll start with Lana and then Khaled, Muhammad as well.
I guess I want to build on what Dr. Jalal was saying, but how populism relates to the PA. And, you know, I don't need to go into examples, but I would love to hear your perspectives on this, because I'm not an expert, obviously, on populism, but someone brought up how populism relates to the Israeli narrative, and that in most cases, Palestinians are excluded from the equation and used as the other to gain support for a given leader. For a while, that was Netanyahu. How does that flip on the PA side? Do we as Palestinians, or even the representation of the Palestinian people, which is the PA, do we use that equation to our own advantage, and in some cases becomes our own form of populism? Do we use that victimhood as our own form of populism, and it tends to grant our own leadership legitimation because they are the leaders of those victims, constantly bringing in this idea of occupation and colonialism, and we are the representation of the Palestinian people who are victims to this, you know, to occupation for the past 70 plus years. I'd love to hear your perspective on that. How does it relate to the Palestinian leadership? And again, it's not to be controversial, but just to see how it relates.
Okay. Dr. Khaled?
Yeah, thanks. Well, my point is maybe to do with the very last sentence that Dr. Erato has said. What I wanted to say is, conceptually, we need to frame the discussion and the question for me in a manner that really relates and reflects the reality, which is colonialism. So you have a colonial context within which you have two unequal parties, a colonized people and a colonizer. So anything that you can apply and that you want to apply equally, whether it was populism or any other kind of term or concept, we have to take into account this reality. And this framing of the question, I think, even for me, takes us away slightly, not slightly, maybe even more than that, from the concept of conflict resolution, unless we are very vigilant. If you say conflict resolution, there is an assumption that you have two almost kind of equal or symmetrical kind of conflict between two parties, and then over a piece of land or over any kind of issue, and there is a resolution that could be found in the middle by compromise. But if you say, no, the context is colonization and decolonization, we have total, I think, different story. And this is where I come from. And this is where I think we have to focus the discussion. Otherwise, we will be kind of driven into consciously or unconsciously to deal with the situation as if we are doing a classical conflict resolution between two parties. Thank you.
Well, I'm not really sure how you reached this conclusion with the questions. I totally agree with you, and I don't put both of them on equal terms, and I think the context is quite different between the two. But I was thinking, and for that reason, I wanted to lay down some foundations. And in that sense, I think the polarization of the Palestinian people, in that sense, it qualifies as trying maybe to think about ways of trying to find agreement between those polarized groups in order to find a way to move forward as Palestinians. In relation to the Israeli question, I think the populism there is taking a different note. And in that sense, I think it is also interesting to see it as a case study. Now, Of course, the context is colonialism. We know that Palestinians are under occupation, but I think to think critically about this, the situation and trying to maybe find ways, innovative ways maybe to think beyond this. I mean, ways to try maybe to deconstruct where we are at. And for that reason, I was thinking of modalities of trying to break up the situation. I don't know, Dr. Muhammad, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you. I hope I'm not intruding this round table for everyone, correct?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So let me, because maybe I live in Austria and US, I can name and do the internal critical observation. But populist in its core, as in the past 2 days we've been saying, in its core has to have components. Exclusionary populism relies on number of strategies. One, it's reductionist in its narrative, essentialist. It boiled down all the Muslim into one profile, all the Arabs in one profile, all the Jews in one profile. That's many of the language used by populist leader. There is no nuances, there is no diversity in that discourse and narrative. It's also dichotomous, us versus them. It's also rely on otherness. It used the strategy of othering people. Othering, you know, they're not from us. So we damp everything on that other, that who's not us. And also it uses dehumanization. And finally, in many ways, if you look at the emotional as well as moral value that they carry, it has an element of superiority. We are better than them. Once you take all those components and you listen to the debate within the Palestinian community, you can find a number of statements of those in the divide between Hamas and Fatah in the past 15 years. That discourse already there, and if we are not able to put it on the table, that's a different question. But to have a political leader, whether it's on the grassroots or it is on the top elite political leader, describe Hamas leadership or Hamas follower using these components, you have a populist approach. To have somebody from within Israel, a Palestinian, who's using within even the Arabs in Israel, some populist discussion were used in the recent election. There is a populist khitab or discourse that is used within the Palestinian context when it comes of dealing with opposition groups, whether it is on election or non-election or whatever the season of the speeches are. That's one. But also, I want to make sure that it's clear for, at least for me, Dr. Khalid and also Dr. Erato in the exchange that the context is very important and essential. It's occupation, it's colonizing project that started in the 1800s. That's a given. We all see that, we all know it. The question in the way we continue to describe it, are we going to look at points of intersection with the other side, or are we going to continue and say, no, we have our own discourse, which is the right one and the correct one, and it comes from our suffering and victimhood, and therefore we have no intersection with the other side unless they take 100% agreement with us, and then we will work with them. However, if they have 50% or 70%, we do not talk to them, we do not deal with their narrative. If you go to the Israeli side, unfortunately, that's the same reality. So we're dealing with an experiment here, not experiment in communication, in, you want to call it conflict resolution, liberation, whatever you want to call it, label it. We're looking at two different narratives, and they both, in many ways, look at the other side and do not see points of intersection. And that's for me the type of conflict resolution that we need to be looking at it in order to convince Palestinian and Israeli public to become more immunized against their own political leader using populist exclusionary discourse in dealing with their issues. That's the main point of this whole discussion for me. It's this raising this awareness in the two sides through academics, through applied work, in order to make people more resilient, more aware that whether it is Hamas, Fatah, Sha'biyya, whatever it is, the political party in the Palestinian side, or any discourse, we should not take it as a fact, but we should check to what extent it uses populist discourse to process certain agenda. The same thing in Shas and every other part of the Israeli society, which are also victim of their own populist leaders who have led them believing in many myths for the last 70 years without necessarily critically thinking about them. I did my spiel, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ayman, would you like to chip in?
شكرا دكتورة ناهد. يعني أنا ربما تكملة للحديث اللي تم وللملاحظات يعني ارتباطا بين الشعبوية والسياق الفلسطيني الداخلي. يعني أنا ملاحظاتي الأساسية إذا إحنا بدنا نعيش في عهد السياسي in the political age، يعني في السياسة في المعنى التقليدي للسياسة، توزيع المصالح وتوزيع الأدوار والقوى السياسية، أنا برأيي يعني الشعبوية الفلسطينية ارتبطت أكثر ربما بالconflict resolution، المفاوضات، إمكانية يعني حل الدولتين. وبالتالي أنا بقول بالمعنى التقليدي للسياسة الشعبوية الفلسطينية كانت أقرب ربما يعني، وهذا بقودها المين ستريم يعني political elites. لكن في مرحلة ما بعد السياسة in the post politics أنا برأيي يعني التركيز يعني على التحرير وحق تقرير المصير ووحدانية الخطاب والانعتاق السياسي والاجتماعي، ربما إحنا بنقول ربما أقرب إلى يعني الكولونيال اوكيوبيشن. فأنا برأيي التمييز ما بين السياسي وما بعد السياسي في الحالة الفلسطينية فهما لبروز الشعبوية، أنا برأيي هذا في غاية الأهمية حتى ندرك طبعا شرعية النخبة. في فترة أبو عمار كانت الخطاب الشعبوي الفلسطيني العرفاتي إذا جاز لي التعبير كان موجه أكثر خارج الحدود. يعني الخطاب الفلسطيني كان موجه ينتقد العرب وينتقد المركز الرأسمالي والغرب وأمريكا وإسرائيل. في مرحلة ما بعد أبو عمار أنا برأيي الشعبوية الفلسطينية صار نقدها داخلي. يعني اليوم إحنا بنشتم بعض أكثر ما بنشتم ربما العرب وإسرائيل وأمريكا. فأنا برأيي في تحولات، هذا بحاجة إلى دراسة دقيقة فيما يتعلق بخطابنا الشعبوي الفلسطيني في مرحلة ما بعد أبو عمار. وبالتالي عشان هيك أنا بعتقد إنه أبو عمار اكتسب الشرعية الأكبر، يعني more legitimacy than طبعا النخبة السياسية اللي تولدت عندنا في مرحلة ما بعد 2007، مرحلة الانقسام، مرحلة الليبرالية الاقتصادية، وحتى النخب السياسية والمجتمعية المحسوبة على المجتمع المدني. شكرا.
Okay, so maybe يحيى بدك تحكي and then we'll move to the Israeli context. أو دكتور إياد.
طيب، يسعد مساكم في الجلسة الختامية. يعني الدكتور أيمن حكى جزء من اللي أنا كنت بدي أحكيه. الشعبوية في الصراع الإسرائيلي الفلسطيني، جوهر النظام السياسي الفلسطيني أحزاب. أنا راح أركز على الأحزاب، وجوهره أيضا في دولة الاحتلال أحزاب. الأحزاب في إسرائيل الآن اللي بتصل الحكم من 2000 إلى عام 2021 هي يمينية وأكثر تطرفاً، وكمان في أعضاء استيطانيين. هدول بياخدوا كتير في خطابهم وبيحكوا بالشعبوية بشكل عام، وأمس كنا بنناقش في شعبوية نتنياهو. كمان الأحزاب الفلسطينية إذا بتشتغل على موضوع الشعبوية هاي مشكلة كبيرة، خصوصا يعني أنا من قطاع غزة بعد العدوان الأخير سمعنا خطاب كتير كان مؤلم من بعض الأحزاب السياسية، وكأنه إحنا اللي محتلين إسرائيل. للأسف الشديد، وهذا وصل للعالم. كان مؤلم جدا علينا يعني كقارئين، بديش أحكي كمثقفين، وأحيانا كانوا المثقفين بنصاعوا لهذا الخطاب. هذه مشكلة كبيرة. إحنا يعني أنا مداخلتي وبدي أركزها في جملة واحدة: إذا إحنا شعب تحت الاحتلال ولا نمتلك من القوة المادية ما يمتلكه الاحتلال اللي بيصنع النانو الآن وأشياء مخيفة، ما بدي أخش في مقارنات.
معلش هالسريع بس.
اوكي، ما بنفع احنا نقاوم. لازم نركز شويه بالمصطلحات وتطبيقاتها على الارض. احنا بلزمنا الاشتباك الشعبي وليس الشعبوي. الشعبي لانه بيقوم على قواعد القانون الدولي اللي كان بيحكي فيها الدكتور أيمن، على الشرعية الدولية، على مقاومة المحتل اللي بتجيزها كافة الأعراف والقوانين الدولية، وليس شعبويا. احنا ما بدنا نقدم خطاب وكأنه احنا شعبويين وإرهابيين وما إلى ذلك. هذا من المهم الانتباه له بشكل كبير. شكرا لك، ما بدي أطول.
اوكي دكتور إياد معلش على السريع
خلينا أعلق دكتورة ناهد بعد إذنك على الجزء الشعبوي في إسرائيل، يعني بس تبلش في القسم الثاني. تفضلي.
Okay, so I guess let's start. نبلش the Israeli case.
Okay. أنا حابب أحكي، إذا بدنا نحكي عن الشعبوية في إسرائيل، بداية نحكي عن السمات اللي بتتميز فيها الشعبوية. فالاحتلال لديه الكثير من السمات التي تمارس من ناحية شعبوية. فمثلا قانون القومية اللي تم سنه في إسرائيل هو أكبر دليل على الشعبوية التي يحشد بها الشارع الإسرائيلي. ومن ضمن المصطلحات التي تستخدم في الشارع الإسرائيلي هي الموت للعرب وشعب الله المختار والأخيار والأشرار، وهذا أدى إلى قتل رابين، وحملت الحكومات الإسرائيلية المتعاقبة بقتل رابين بسبب الشعبوية التي مارسها في ذلك الوقت نتنياهو ضد رابين، على أساس أنه كان هو من الأشرار في المجتمع الإسرائيلي ويبيع أرض إسرائيل للفلسطينيين. كمان نضيف إلى ذلك ممارسة الاحتلال في الضفة الغربية. عندما يقتل إسرائيلي في داخل الضفة الغربية، تكون المصطلحات المستخدمة من قبل الاحتلال وإذاعاته وإعلامه تختلف تماما عن ما يمارسه الاحتلال عندما يتم قتل إسرائيلي في داخل الضفة الغربية. وأكبر دليل على ذلك عندما قتلت فتاة بواسطة الحجارة من المستوطنين، رفض الاحتلال أن يهدم بيتها من خلال القانون الإسرائيلي، ولكنه يهدم أي بيت فلسطيني يثبت لديهم أنه قتل إسرائيلي. كمان الممارسات، آخر نقطة دكتورة ناهد، آخر ممارسة للاحتلال في موضوع الشعبوي: أي فلسطيني يتحدث على الفيسبوك أو على التواصل الاجتماعي يتم استدعائه فورا للمخابرات الإسرائيلية، وهذا يؤدي إلى كبح ضد الفلسطينيين. وشكرا لكم.
شكرا. Okay, so I would also like to build on what Andrew was saying in relation to the threats that are caused by populists in power. And in that sense, the threat to the civil society as a space for the citizens to practice their freedom and rights, to voice out their stand, their political stand, their concerns, and so on. Do you see that we are already in this kind of stage in whether the Palestinian or the Israeli context? And if not, is it inevitable that we would reach to that stage? Dr. Raf, would you like to comment? You're on mute, Isa.
Thank you. Good evening to everybody, everywhere. Given that this is really international, thanks to Zoom, we can have international conferences very easily now. I've been listening to the debate about populism in Israel, Palestine, and I'm not sure how far the category to be deployed in the Palestinian context is productive, or at least the way the category has been developed in the literature in the last decade or so, as a crisis in liberal democracy in the West, as the rise of authoritarianism, as emphasis on majoritarian democracy, as an animosity toward liberal values and basic freedoms, as an attack on the media, which all are taking place within a state. Whether a populist movement are in power, or even if they are not in power, they formulate their discourse, what they would do if they get into power. So to confuse the analysis of populism in already established state to situation where it's a semi-revolution, I think it's not that we cannot think of populism within the Palestinian society and other societies that are even colonized, but we need completely very different tools from those conceptual tools that had been developing in the analysis of populism, even in Latin America or the US or in Hungary. This is another kind of populism, actually, which is probably, we might find a new name for it. It's probably revolutionary populism. Is the fact that revolutionaries appoint themselves as the true speaker of the revolution, that don't accept any criticism, or they do not accept any second thought about their victimhood, or, but this is another way of thinking. So here probably populism is not coming from the authorities, it's coming more from the grassroots, actually. It's so, and I'm not aware of any literature who has been developing in analyzing the discourse of such groups. Most of the literature that I know is coming from states that already have their sovereignty, they have their statehood. Now, populism could be those in power, but it can be, as Le Pen or many others, it could be many movement on the opposition, but it takes place within the idea that of sovereignty. That doesn't mean, again, that we cannot analyze populism even within Palestinian discourse. I myself experience many times populism, sort of an appeal of simple-minded, clear-cut answers to very sophisticated questions, like we are total victim, they're total victimizer, or sharp binaries that aim to reach clear-cut solutions. But I'm not sure that the discourse of populism as we know it, as is, you open now JSTOR and read about populism, that this is the kind. So I think we need our own tools. We can learn from that literature, but there's something more to be said to study such kind of populism. Now, speaking about Israel, like in many other cases, Israel is really a laboratory. It's for many concepts. You can study it's ready-made for populism, as it's ready-made for theories of the exception. I mean, anybody living in Israel, we didn't need Agamben nor Carl Schmitt to understand the persistence of the state of exception in Israel. So many of the ingredients that feeds populist talk are already there in Israel, and already there before the rise of the populism. So we shouldn't actually overanalyze the recent trend in Israel, the right-wing rise in Israel, through the language of populism. Populism can do some work in that aspect, but the seed for Israeli populism, right-wingism, if you want, of revisionism, of militarism, of the persistent of the exception, of the persistence of the state of emergency, of the denial of the validity of the constituted power, and more emphasis on the constitutive power. That is to say, the persistent of the revolution, in that sense that Zionism is more a revolution than a state. So the revolution doesn't recognize its own son, its own product, which is the state. So the energy of the revolution is ongoing in Israel. It's a revolution that cannot prescribe or tell us beforehand when it's going, where its stopping point. It treats the whole constitutional theory, the institutional and legal apparatus with such in a dismissive way. Now, all these ingredients has been all the time in Israel. Really, they are upgraded under Netanyahu in the last 10 years. So I think in studying populism in Israel, and there are clear manifestation of the rise of populism in the last 10 years under Netanyahu, attack on the Supreme Court, attack on the media, attack on the intelligentsia, on university professors, the friend-enemy distinction all the time, the state of emergency all the time. I mean, all the ingredients that you see in populism, you see them in Israel. But I think the point in studying Israel is at the same time to see the continuity of this conceptual trajectory, and to see at the same time in what sense we reached a new level on the same continuum, like the recent law before 2 or 3 years. In what sense it's a continuation? In what sense it's a new threshold? I took too much time, so I would stop here.
I think in that sense, it's quite interesting. I'll just add a couple of sentences. For me, I feel that it's more of a maturation. Like in that sense, I think the state of Israel has been continuously in this pull and push between the populist ideology of the state, which I think came with the state itself in terms, and if you look at for example, Yoav Peled's distinction of being Israeli, and you see how the breakup of the different part of the society, and in that sense, exclusion is always there, but it's not as it is clear now. And in that sense, I don't know if we have reached a point where there is a maturation of a populist sentiment with an identity that is already consolidated, which was not there before. I mean, it's just something that I've been thinking about, but I'm not sure.
Let me make a comment here. I mean, what more exclusion than the transfer in 1948? It means Israel spared itself a clear-cut apartheid regime thanks to the expulsion of the Palestinians in 1948. If you expel people physically from the land, you don't have to expel them or to discriminate against them in the body, in the legal text. They simply disappear. So exclusion is the founding principle that allowed, on the top of it, some liberal democracy in Israel to arise. Without this expulsion, Israel wouldn't give voting rights for Palestinians. So this is the condition without which Israeli limited liberal democracy couldn't be established. Now, the rise of exclusionism in Israel now, 70 years after the establishment of the state, for two reasons. One is that Israel is expanding its borders to include the West Bank. And in this sense, the old ideas of separation becoming impossible, then we have to theorize away what do we do with the Palestinians in the West Bank. So in many ways, the West Bank is becoming in Israel, and the increasing role and the presence of Palestinians of Israel in the legal and political discourse. These two things put on Israel elites a pressure to theorize. How can we theorize the entity between the river and the sea? And you have to remember, Israel has been running the West Bank in an authoritarian way through military commanders. Most of those military commanders who think in authoritarian terms enter politics. That's the way they think to run the universe. They think they can run universe by issuing orders. So the continuation of the occupation and the presence of the Palestinians that they can not anymore ignore creates a politics of exclusion on the face of Israeli politics. What they could hide until recently through imagined future Palestinian state, they gave up on two-state solution, and now we're stuck in one reality. So we're more like South Africa, more and more, and this invites both authoritarianism and discourse of exclusion. But this has always been there as potentiality, but the recent reality brought it to more to the surface, more to actuality. Sorry again, I'll stop, that's it.
Thank you. Dr. Carlos, would you like to say something?
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank you. I have learned a lot in this conference. And what I would like to say is that we always have to keep it, and I'm talking about the situation of Palestinians in the occupied territories. We always have to make a distinction between, as Jean Cohen Arato were saying, between the popular and populism. When we talk about populism, we're talking about a particular phenomenon in which rivals become political enemies. A sector of the population is considered by the leader to represent the whole. And finally, you have a particular type of leadership. It's leadership as embodiment. The leader is the savior of the people. So that distinction is very important. We also have to make a distinction between populism and national liberation. Not all movements of national liberation were populist or ended up in populism. And finally, I think that it's very important to think about the state. Whether or not you can have, of course, you can have movements of national liberation that at certain moments will use a populist discourse or populist rhetoric, but using populist rhetoric for me is not enough to become a populist. You have to be able to be in power. You have to be able to be in office. And so I just wanted to say that and to thank you for all of the things that I have been learning in these 3 days.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we're gonna be wrapping up. So maybe I'll take a few comments. Dr. Raed, would you like to say something? And Dr. Dalal.
شكرا كثير. أنا شوية أثرت انتباهي تعليق الدكتور خالد حروب، واللي عزز لي فكرة إنه مش بالضرورة الشعبوية يكون في لها يعني قيادة إنسانية، خلينا نقول يعني ممكن تكون حوالين فكرة معينة. وبعتقد إنه هذا هو الموجود في الصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي يعني، وهذا اللي بيفسر مثلا إنه نتنياهو راح أجا بنت وهم بدوروا حول نفس الفكر. يعني أعتقد الفكرة ممكن تكون هي القيادة في هذه الحالة. وبعتقد إنه بخصوص الصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي وتحديدا من الجانب الإسرائيلي قديش بنقدر نستبعد الأفكار الدينية على مجريات الصراع بعتقد أو الفهم الخاطئ خلينا نقول للنصوص الدينية بشكل أساسي بجوز عند الجانب الإسرائيلي، لأنه أكثر اليمين اللي بحكم إسرائيل صار له فترة طويلة، وبشكل جزئي ممكن عند الطرف الفلسطيني جزئيا. قديش بنقدر نبعد هذا الفهم تسييس النصوص الدينية عن الصراع؟ بعتقد قديش ممكن نصل شكل من أشكال بداية الحل للصراع. شكرا.
Dr. Dalal.
Thank you, Dr. Nahed. Well, before the conference, whenever I wanted to apply the term populism on Israel, I would automatically think maybe of certain figures as, populist leaders. But now I have to share with you and admit that if we look at the relationship between the state of Israel and populism, here we cannot ignore the fact that Israel is labeled with apartheid. And Israel had introduced publicly and very bluntly with audacity the Jewish nation state law. So if we consider, for example, the 2 million Palestinians who are not Jewish, who speak a different language, and then now if I want to link that to the basic definition, which was reiterated so many times during the conference, which is bringing people together against a previously defined enemy, so one enemy. So it would be very, very difficult now for me to apply the term populism into the Israeli context. Having said so, maybe now it is much easier for me to apply it into somebody like Mansour Abbas, for example, who is actually adopting a populist narrative or rhetoric in the bringing people together or with a nation, unlike having this concept, adopted or carried upon by any Israeli. It is, I think now Israel as a state is a very, very unique case when it comes to theorizing and applying populism in the context of Israel. And I wanted to share my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so anybody would like to say anything before we close? It has been 3 wonderful days. Thank you all for being part of it. And I think we will conclude here. شكرا كتير للجميع للحضور ويعطيكم العافية بدعتوا. Thanks a lot, and thank you, Andrew, Carlos, Dr. Muhammad, Dr. Khaled, Dr. Raif, and everybody else. I would like to specifically thank my mentor and Professor Andrew for being here and for sharing your thoughts with us. Till next time, thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day and evening. Bye.